Tonight, picture a place where the snow that is falling has been falling for 800,000 years. It is the middle of the long dark, somewhere near the bottom of the world, and there is no sound out here except a dry hiss of ice crystals moving along the surface of the ice. Very slowly, the way sand moves across a beach when nobody is watching. Above you, the sky is not black. It is a deep and glowing blue, and it is crowded with more stars than you have ever been allowed to see, and along the horizon, a curtain of pale green light is folding and unfolding itself without any hurry at all. Underneath your feet there is ice, not a few feet of ice, not a season of ice. Underneath your feet there is nearly 2.5 miles of it, pressed down, layer on layer on layer. Each layer a single quiet winter, going down and down until the very bottom of it is older than our species. And beneath all of that, sealed away in the dark and the pressure, there is a lake of liquid water the size of a small country that has not felt a single breath of wind since long before there were people to feel wind. That is where we are going tonight. We are going to Antarctica, the coldest, the driest, the windiest, the emptiest, and quite possibly the strangest continent on this planet, and we are going to do it slowly, in 100 small, soft, sleepy facts, and you do not have to remember a single one of them. Settle now into whatever stillness you have made for yourself. Let the lamp go dim. Let the room go quiet. Let your shoulders come down from wherever they have been holding themselves all day, one gentle inch at a time. And let the small weight of everything you meant to finish today slide off them and lie somewhere on the floor where it can wait until morning. It will wait. It always does. If you enjoy what I do here, and only if you truly do, you are very welcome to leave a like on this video, or to subscribe, so that the next long, quiet night finds its way to you on its own. And if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time down in the comments. It sounds like a small thing, but it helps other sleepless people find their way here, and there is something rather comforting about scrolling through a list of strangers who are all awake at 3 a.m. in different parts of the world, all of them listening to the same voice, talking gently about ice. There will be no shocks tonight. Nothing will jump out at you. Nothing will be withheld and dangled in front of you to keep you awake. I am going to tell you 100 true things about the bottom of the world in one long, unhurried line, and my only real ambition is that you will not hear the end of it. So, before there was a continent of ice, there was no ice at all. That is where we begin, one layer before the story starts, because it makes all the rest of it make sense. Fact number 1. Antarctica has not always been white. For most of its existence, it was green. Around 100 million years ago, when the great southern supercontinent of Gondwana was still holding together, the land we now call Antarctica sat further north and wore forests. Temperate rainforest, ferns, conifers, southern beech, swampy river deltas with root mats a foot thick. Fossil wood is still lying in the transantarctic mountains today, wood with growth rings in it, and those growth rings are strange because they are very wide on one side and very narrow on the other. They are the rings of trees that were already living at a polar latitude. Trees that had learned to grow furiously through a summer of endless daylight and then to shut down completely and stand in the dark for months. Those trees drop their leaves all at once each autumn, and the leaf mats are still there, pressed flat into stone. There are fossils of dinosaurs in Antarctica. There are fossils of small marsupials. There are fossils of a beech forest that stood not far from where the ice is now, nearly 2 miles deep. Fact number 2. The reason it turned white was not that the sun moved, but that a doorway opened. Antarctica had been joined to South America, and around 34 million years ago, that connection broke and the Drake Passage opened up. Once the sea could run all the way around the bottom of the world without hitting anything, it did exactly that, and it has not stopped since. That current is called the Antarctic Circumpolar Current. It is the largest ocean current on the planet, and what it does essentially is draw a wall of cold water around the whole continent and refuse to let any warm water in. Antarctica was cut off. It was left alone in the cold with the door shut, and it has been alone ever since, and it froze. Fact number 3. The ice sheet that grew there is the single largest object of its kind on Earth. It covers a little over 5 million square miles, which is bigger than the United States and Mexico put together, and it does not cover 90% of the continent, or 95%. It covers about 98%. All the bare rock and all the exposed cliffs and every mountain peak sticking out of the ice added together come to roughly the area of one moderate country scattered in fragments around the edge of something the size of 2 continents. Fact number 4. That ice holds about 7 million cubic miles of frozen fresh water. Numbers of that size stop meaning anything after a while, so here is the version that means something. Somewhere between 60 and 70% of all the fresh water on this planet is currently sitting in Antarctica, in the form of ice, doing nothing at all. Every river you have ever seen, every lake, every reservoir, all the rain and every cloud in the sky at this exact moment, all of it together is a rounding error next to the water that is quietly stacked up at the bottom of the world in solid form. Fact number 5. If all of it melted, the sea would come up by about 190 feet. That is not a prediction, and it is not going to happen tonight, and I am not telling you this to worry you. I am telling you because it gives you a sense of the mass involved. One continent holding enough water to lift every ocean on Earth over the tops of most coastal cathedrals. Fact number 6. The ice is so heavy that the land underneath it has sunk. Rock behaves like something very stiff and very slow when you put enough weight on it, and the weight here is beyond imagining. And so the bedrock of Antarctica has been pressed down into the mantle by something on the order of half a mile. There are enormous regions of Antarctic bedrock that are currently below sea level, not because they were carved down there, but because they have been shoved down there by the ice sitting on top of them. If the ice were ever removed, the land would slowly rise back up again over thousands of years, the way a cushion rises when you finally get up out of a chair. Fact number 7. The thickest ice ever measured in Antarctica is about 15,670 feet deep, nearly 3 miles. It sits in a place called the Astrolabe Subglacial Basin, in a region called Adley Land, and it was found by flying an aircraft back and forth across a featureless white plain with a radar pointed at the ground. From the surface, there is nothing there at all. It is just flat white in every direction, so flat and so featureless that pilots have to trust their instruments completely, and underneath that unremarkable flatness is a hole in the earth 3 miles deep, filled entirely with ice. Fact number 8. The average thickness taken across the whole continent is about 1 2/10 miles. Not the deepest point, the average. Stand anywhere on the interior of Antarctica, and the odds are very good that the true surface of the planet is more than a mile below your boots, and that everything between you and it is compressed snow that fell before your country existed. Fact number 9. It is really 2 ice sheets, not 1, and they are quite different animals. The East Antarctic ice sheet is the giant. It sits on high ground, it is thick and cold and old and stubborn, and it holds most of the ice on the continent. The West Antarctic ice sheet is smaller, lower, warmer, and sits largely on a bed that is below sea level, which makes it far more sensitive and far more talked about. Between them run the Transantarctic Mountains, a range some 2,000 miles long that splits the continent from the Ross Sea to the Weddell Sea, and much of that range is buried up to its neck in the ice it is holding back. Fact number 10. The very top of the East Antarctic ice sheet is a place called Dome Argus, or Dome A, and it sits at about 13,400 feet above sea level. It is the highest point of the ice sheet. It is one of the calmest and clearest places on the planet, and the air above it is so still and so dry that astronomers regard it as very nearly the finest natural sight on Earth for a telescope. It is also, by a considerable margin, one of the most unpleasant places a human being could choose to stand, which is a fairly good summary of the entire relationship between science and comfort. Before we go on to the shape of the continent, stay with the ice itself for a little while, because it is worth understanding how a snowflake becomes something 2 miles thick, and it is a very calming process to follow downward. Imagine a single crystal of snow settling onto the plateau tonight. It is a delicate, branched thing, mostly air, and it lands on a surface of other crystals just like it, and there it sits. Nothing melts it, because nothing there is ever warm enough. Nothing washes it away, because there is no rain and no running water. The wind may pick it up and move it a few yards and put it down again. And in doing so, it will break the fine branches off and round the crystal into a small blunt grain. And that grain will settle into the pack with 1,000 others. Over the next few years, more snow arrives on top, an inch or two a year, and the weight of it presses down, and the grains begin to touch one another more firmly and to weld together at their contact points. The material stops being snow and becomes something in between, granular, crunchy, still full of connected air spaces, and it has its own name, firn, which is a word borrowed from the German for last year's snow. Firn is what the top 100 feet or so of the plateau is made of, and if you dig a pit into it, which glaciologists do constantly, you can see the years in the walls. Faint bands of coarser and finer grain, and you can put your hand into the year you were born. Keep going down. At around 100 to 300 feet, depending on how cold and how dry that particular part of the continent is, the pressure closes the last of the connected passageways between grains, and the air that is left has nowhere to escape to. It is sealed in as bubbles, and at that moment the firn becomes ice, and a small pocket of the atmosphere becomes a specimen. Below that, the ice goes on being compressed for thousands of years, and the bubbles get smaller and smaller under the growing pressure until, deeper still, they vanish altogether. Because at that pressure, the gas is forced into the crystal structure of the ice itself, forming a clathrate, in which the air is held inside a cage of water molecules and is no longer a bubble at all. Deep Antarctic ice, taken from 2 miles down, is therefore not white and not cloudy. It is astonishingly clear, glassy, almost invisible in water, and enormously dense, and when it is brought up to the surface, it can be dangerous to handle. Because the trapped gas inside it is at a pressure it has not had to cope with for a very long time, and cores have been known to fracture explosively in the drill shed as they relax. There is a name for that too. Drillers call it brittle ice. And there is a depth range in every deep core, usually somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 feet, where the sections come up cracking and popping, and they are left in a cold room for a year to settle down before anyone tries to cut them. Ice from that stage of the process has a color, and the color is the reason so many Antarctic photographs look faked. Pure thick ice is blue. Water molecules absorb light very slightly at the red end of the spectrum, so red is removed first. And the further light has to travel through ice, the more red it loses, and what comes back out the other side is blue, pale and greenish in a few feet, a deep, saturated cobalt in 100. Where a crevasse opens, the walls glow blue downward into the dark. Where a glacier calves, the newly exposed face is blue. Where the wind has scoured a plain down to the ancient ice beneath. That whole plain is faintly blue, and it takes a polish, and vehicles have to be driven across it with the care of somebody crossing a ballroom floor. White ice is white because it is full of bubbles and cracks that scatter every color equally. Blue ice is blue because everything that could scatter the light has been squeezed out of it, and it has become simple. So the picture to hold, as you settle down a little further, is a column. At the top, tonight's snow, weightless, arranging itself. A few feet down, the snow of your own childhood, already rounded and packed. 50 feet down, the winter your grandparents were born in. A few hundred feet down, the last of the bubbles closing, and the air of the 18th century sealed inside them, and beneath that, the ice going clear and deep and blue and old. Thousands of years to the foot, down past the ash of eruptions with no witnesses, down past ice ages, down past the arrival of our species, down through everything, until, at the very bottom, in the dark, at a pressure of 350 atmospheres, the ice is soft with the Earth's own faint heat, and there is a dark lake lying there that no one has ever seen. That is what is underneath the flat white nothing in every photograph of Antarctica you have ever looked at. Nothing about it is in any hurry. The snow that fell on the plateau on the night you were born has moved perhaps 100 feet since, and has another 800,000 years of patient sinking ahead of it, and it will get there whether anybody is paying attention or not. Let your breathing find that pace for a moment if it likes, in and out, and no rush about the next one. And now let us go back up to the surface and look at the shape of the thing. Fact number 11. The ice is not still. It looks still. From a distance, it looks like the most permanent thing you have ever seen. A white lid clamped over the bottom of the world. And it is in fact moving all the time, everywhere, in every direction, outward from the high center toward the sea. Ice under enough pressure stops behaving like a solid and begins to behave like an extremely reluctant liquid. The crystals inside it slip past one another, grain by grain, and the whole sheet spreads under its own weight the way honey spreads across a plate if you are patient enough to watch. In the deep interior, it creeps at a few feet a year, which is slow enough that you would need to plant a flag and come back with your grandchildren to prove it. Near the coast, where the ice is thinner and steeper and closer to the sea, it can move thousands of feet in a year. The entire continent is quietly pouring itself into the ocean, and has been for millions of years, and will still be doing it long after everyone who has ever thought about it is gone. Fact number 12. Inside that slow general creep there are rivers. They are called ice streams, and they are one of the strangest features on the planet. Corridors of fast ice, sometimes 30 miles wide and hundreds of miles long, sliding through the surrounding ice sheet at 10, 20, 100 times the speed of the ice on either side of them. Their edges are torn into sheer margins of shattered crevasses. And if you could stand at that margin, you would be standing with one boot on ice that is barely moving and the other on ice that is racing past at a walking pace measured over years. What lets them slide is water. There is a thin, dark film of meltwater and soft, wet sediment at the bottom, only inches thick, and that film is doing the same job that a spill of water does under a plate on a smooth table. The largest of these, the Lambert Glacier, drains something like 1/10 of the whole East Antarctic ice sheet down a valley 250 miles long and up to 60 miles wide. And it is generally regarded as the largest glacier on Earth. Fact number 13. When those glaciers reach the sea, they do not stop. They keep going out over the water until they are floating, and what floats there is an ice shelf, which is one of the more astonishing things this planet builds. The Ross Ice Shelf is a single continuous slab of floating ice roughly the size of France. Its seaward edge is a cliff of ice up to 200 feet high, running unbroken for about 600 miles, and the early explorers who sailed along it called it, quite simply, the barrier, because it was. And because at that point nobody had any better word for a wall of ice with no beginning and no end and no way through. Under it, in permanent darkness, there is a cavity of seawater hundreds of feet deep and hundreds of miles wide, sealed off from the sky by a lid of ice in which things nevertheless live. Fact number 14. Antarctica has more than a dozen major ice shelves, and the second great one is the Filchner Ronde, tucked into the Weddell Sea on the far side of the continent. Together with the Ross, it forms one of the two enormous rectangular bites you can see in any map of Antarctica, the places where the coastline looks suspiciously straight. Those straight coastlines are not coastlines at all. They are the floating edges of ice shelves redrawn every few decades when a piece breaks off, which means that the shape of Antarctica on your globe is partly a matter of when the globe was printed. Fact number 15. Ice shelves work as brakes. This is the part that took scientists a long time to appreciate. A floating shelf adds nothing directly to sea level, because it is already floating and already displacing its own weight in the same way that an ice cube melting in a glass does not make the glass overflow. But the shelf is pressed up against islands and seabed shoals and the walls of its own bay, and that friction holds it back, and it in turn holds back the grounded glaciers feeding into it. Remove the shelf and the glaciers behind it speed up, sometimes dramatically. It is the difference between a door and a doorstop. The door is not the point. The doorstop is the point. Fact number 16. When a piece of shelf finally lets go, it does so on a scale that is difficult to keep in your head. In the year 2000, an iceberg called B-15 calved from the Ross Ice Shelf. It measured about 183 miles long and 23 miles wide, which is a piece of floating ice larger than the island of Jamaica. It drifted, it grounded, it split, and its fragments were still being tracked by satellite more than 15 years later, some of them washing up as far away as New Zealand. Antarctic icebergs are given a letter for the quadrant they came from and a number for their order of appearance, which is a very calm and bureaucratic way of naming something the size of a small nation. Fact number 17. Antarctic icebergs are usually flat. This is the difference between them and the ones from Greenland, which are the jagged, picturesque kind that sank ships in the North Atlantic. Because Antarctic bergs break from the flat underside and flat top of an ice shelf, they come out as tabular icebergs, enormous floating tables with sheer sides and level tops so flat and so wide that from the deck of a ship they look like a coastline that has quietly detached itself and started to travel. Some of them are large enough to have their own weather. Some carry a shallow lake of blue meltwater on top in the summer, sitting there in perfect stillness 600 miles from anywhere. Fact number 18. Every winter, Antarctica roughly doubles in size, and then in the spring it gives all of it back. This is the sea ice, and it is the largest seasonal event on the surface of the Earth. In February, at the end of the southern summer, sea ice around Antarctica covers something like 1.2 million square miles. By September, at the end of the winter, it covers around 7 million. An area larger than the continent itself freezes over and then melts again every single year in a slow-breathing rhythm that has been going on without interruption for as long as there has been an Antarctic. Nothing else on this planet changes its size that much, that regularly. Fact number 19. The sea ice does not simply appear as a sheet. It has stages, and the stages have some of the best vocabulary in all of science. First, the water turns greasy and takes on an oily sheen, and that is called grease ice. Then it thickens into a soft slush of crystals called frazil. Then, if the sea is choppy, the slush gathers itself into round, pale plates that bump their edges against one another until each plate has a raised rim. And a whole ocean of them looks exactly like a field of enormous floating lily pads. That is pancake ice, and it is one of the most beautiful things anybody has ever photographed from a ship. Eventually, the pancakes freeze together into a solid sheet, and the sheet thickens and the sea has closed over for the winter. Fact number 20. When seawater freezes, the salt does not go with it. Ice crystals form out of pure water and push the salt aside, and that leftover salt has to go somewhere, so it drains downward as an extremely cold, extremely salty brine. That brine is denser than any other water in the ocean, and it sinks, and it goes on sinking all the way to the seafloor, where it begins to spread north along the bottom of the world's oceans as Antarctic bottom water. It moves under everything. It fills the deepest basins of the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Indian Oceans, and it takes centuries to make the journey. And it is one of the great slow engines that keeps the whole planetary ocean turning over. The bottom of the deep sea, everywhere in the world, is cold because Antarctica made it cold and then quietly pushed it north while nobody was looking. Fact number 21. The coldest air temperature ever properly recorded at the surface of this planet was measured in Antarctica at a Russian research station called Vostok on the 21st of July, 1983. It was minus 128.6 degrees Fahrenheit. That is minus 89.2 on the Celsius scale. And it is a number that does not really translate into anything a human body has words for. At that temperature, boiling water thrown into the air does not fall. It detonates into a cloud of ice fog and drifts away. Steel becomes brittle enough to snap. Diesel fuel turns to jelly. ordinary rubber shatters like a biscuit. Breathing is genuinely dangerous without something over your face, because you can freeze the moist tissue of your own airway, and the men who work there learn to breathe through a long loop of scarf and to speak as little as possible, which is not a bad rule anywhere. What makes Vostok so cold is a combination of three things stacked on top of each other. It sits at 11,000 feet on the polar plateau, so the air is thin. It is more than 700 miles from the nearest ocean, so nothing warm can reach it, and it spends 4 months in complete darkness, radiating whatever heat it has straight out into space with nothing in the sky to hold it in. Cold in Antarctica is not really a temperature. It is an accumulation. It is what happens when a place is allowed to lose heat continuously for months with no interruption and nothing whatsoever coming back the other way. Fact number 22. Colder places have since been found by satellite in the little hollows between the high domes of the East Antarctic Plateau. Instruments in orbit that measure the temperature of the surface itself rather than the air above it have recorded pockets of snow at around minus 144 degrees Fahrenheit. These are shallow dips in the ice, only a few feet deep and a mile or so across, where the very coldest and heaviest air puddles and settles and simply stays, like cold water in the bottom of a bath. It has to be clear, calm, dry and dark for several days running, and then, in those particular hollows, the snow reaches a temperature that has never been measured naturally anywhere else on the surface of the earth. Nobody has ever stood in one of them at that moment. It is entirely possible that nobody ever will. There is something appealing about that. The coldest place on the planet is a shallow dent in the snow that nobody has visited, that only exists on certain nights, and that goes back to being unremarkable as soon as the wind picks up. Fact number 23. Antarctica is a desert. This surprises people more than almost anything else about it, because the entire continent is made of frozen water, but rainfall and snowfall are what define a desert, and by that measure the interior of Antarctica is one of the driest places that exists. The high plateau receives about 2 inches of precipitation a year, measured as liquid water, which puts it in the same category as the Atacama and drier than most of the Sahara. The snow you see blowing across the plateau is almost never new snow. It is old snow being moved around. It falls once in tiny quantities, and then it is picked up and put down and picked up again for centuries, and it never melts, and so it accumulates anyway, a fraction of an inch at a time, until it is 2 miles thick. The Great Ice Sheet is not the product of heavy snowfall. It is the product of very light snowfall that was never, ever taken away. Fact number 24. The air is so dry that dehydration is a constant problem, and it catches people out badly, because it does not feel like thirst in a hot country feels. Every breath you take on the plateau has to be warmed and moistened by your own body. And every breath you let out carries that moisture away and gives it to the sky, and you can lose several pints of water a day simply by existing and breathing. Field parties are told to drink far more than they want to. Sweat evaporates instantly and invisibly. Skin cracks. Lips split. Paper becomes strangely crisp, and photographs curl. Wooden crates that arrive from New Zealand slowly loosen at the joints as the last of the moisture leaves them, and it is possible for a piece of furniture to fall apart quietly in a storeroom over the course of a year without anybody touching it. Fact number 25. Antarctica is also the windiest continent, and the wind there has its own name and its own mechanism. It is called katabatic wind from the Greek for going downhill, and it works like this. Air over the high interior plateau is chilled by contact with the ice until it becomes extremely dense and heavy. Heavy air is pulled downhill by gravity exactly as water would be. And the interior of Antarctica is essentially a dome, so that dense air begins to slide outward and downward toward the coast in every direction at once. As it descends, it is funneled into valleys and squeezed, and it accelerates, and by the time it arrives at the coast, it can be moving at highway speeds without a single storm anywhere on the map. This is wind produced purely by shape and by cold. The continent breathes out all year, all the time, downhill, fact number 26. The windiest place is generally agreed to be Commonwealth Bay in George V Land, where the Australian explorer Douglas Mawson built a hut in 1912 and then spent 2 years being sandblasted by his own address. The average wind speed there over a full year is around 50 miles an hour, which means that a 50-mile-an-hour wind is not weather, it is Tuesday. Gusts were recorded at over 200 miles an hour. Mawson's men learned to walk leaning forward at an angle that would have been comical anywhere else, hacking footholds into the ice with a pick in order to make progress across 100 yards. And they named the place with the flat resignation of people who had stopped expecting sympathy, the home of the blizzard. Fact number 27. There is a category of Antarctic weather that has almost no equivalent elsewhere, and it is called a whiteout, and it is not a storm. A whiteout can occur on a perfectly calm day. A thin, even layer of cloud diffuses the sunlight so completely that light arrives at the snow from every direction equally, and with light coming from everywhere, nothing casts a shadow. Without shadows, a snow surface has no texture and no features whatsoever, and the horizon disappears, because the white ground and the white sky are exactly the same shade. People in a whiteout have walked into snowdrifts they could not see, stepped off ledges they had no way of detecting, and, most famously, flown perfectly serviceable aircraft into a slope that was invisible from a mile away. It is not darkness. It is the opposite of darkness. It is being blinded by an excess of perfectly even light, which is a very strange way to lose your bearings. Fact number 28. In compensation, the Antarctic sky produces optical effects of a kind you will not see anywhere warm. Because the air is full of tiny suspended ice crystals, all of them hexagonal, all of them acting as small prisms and mirrors, sunlight arrives bent and reflected and multiplied. There are halos, rings of pale light around the sun. There are sun dogs, which are bright false suns sitting on either side of the real one at the same height, keeping pace with it across the sky. There are sun pillars, vertical shafts of light standing straight up from the horizon. On the coldest, clearest days there is diamond dust, which is ice falling out of an apparently empty blue sky, glittering as it drifts, with no cloud anywhere to have produced it. Explorers describe skies with 2 or 3 false suns and a complete circle of light joining them, and were routinely disbelieved when they came home on the grounds that this was obviously too much. Let us pause among all that cold for a moment and talk about what it is actually like to be a warm-blooded animal inside it, because the practical details are strangely soothing, in the way that any set of well-worn routines is soothing. Nobody down there thinks about the cold in the abstract. They think about layers and about zips. and about the order in which things are put on, and about not sweating. Sweat is the enemy. A person who works too hard in polar clothing produces moisture, and that moisture soaks the insulation, and wet insulation stops insulating, and then the cold arrives properly. So the first thing everyone learns is to move slowly and to keep adjusting. Unzip before you are warm, zip up before you are cold. Take a layer off before the hill rather than after it. The clothing itself has a rhythm to it. Next to the skin, something thin that moves moisture outward. Over that, fleece or wool, which goes on holding warmth even when damp. Over that, down, thick and light and useless when wet. Which is exactly why the outer layer is a windproof shell rather than a waterproof one, because there is no rain to keep out and the entire enemy is moving air. On the feet, a vapor barrier, a thick sock, and an enormous insulated boot with a removable liner that comes out every night and is put somewhere warm so that tomorrow morning does not begin with the demoralizing business of pushing a foot into frozen felt. On the hands, a thin glove that never comes off, because bare skin on cold metal is a mistake you make once. And over it, a mitten on a long cord round the neck, because a mitten dropped in a wind is a mitten in another country. On the head, everything at once. And over the face, a fur ruff around the hood, which is not decoration and is not fashion. It breaks the wind before the wind reaches skin, and it creates a small pocket of still warm air in front of the face. And the traditional design of that ruff has not been improved upon in 100 years because it is already correct. Then there are the small, strange details, the ones nobody warns you about. Metal spectacle frames conduct heat away from the bridge of the nose and will freeze to it. Breathing through the mouth in extreme cold is unpleasant and slightly dangerous. So people learn to breathe through a scarf and to talk less, and conversation on a sledge journey tends to happen at rest stops rather than on the move. Beards freeze into a solid mass and have to be thawed out indoors with a mug of something hot held under the chin. Camera batteries die in minutes and are kept in an inside pocket against the body and swapped in and out. Fuel is handled with extreme care because cold fuel splashed on skin will cause an instant frostbite injury without feeling wet or cold at all. Pen ink freezes, so notes are taken in pencil, and the pencil is on a string. Tape does not stick, glue does not set, plastic goes brittle and snaps. Snow squeaks underfoot at a certain temperature, and then, colder still. It stops squeaking and starts to sound like polystyrene, and old hands can tell you the temperature within a few degrees from the sound of their own footsteps. And there is the business of the nose, which is that at 50 below, the moisture in every breath freezes on the inside of the fur ruff, and by the end of a working day, there is a white rime of your own breathing built up around your face, which you have to break off in pieces before you go inside. Indoors is its own world, and it is deliberately, aggressively cozy. Field huts and station corridors smell of diesel and cooking and drying socks. The stove is the social center of any tent. Meals are enormous because people in the cold burn something like 5,000 calories a day simply keeping their core temperature up. And the food is heavy on butter and fat in a way that would appall a doctor anywhere else and is exactly right there. Tea is constant. Water has to be made, always from snow, in a pot, which takes far longer than anyone expects and is somebody's job every single evening. Fill the pot, melt it down to an inch of water, fill it again, melt it again 4 or 5 times for 1 pot of water. It is the polar equivalent of fetching wood. And like fetching wood, it is a job that occupies the hands and leaves the mind free, and people who have wintered often say it was their favorite part of the day. And then, at the end of it, the sleeping bag. A polar sleeping bag is an extraordinary object, thick as a mattress, and getting into one is a small operation. And the first 10 minutes are cold because you are warming it up rather than the other way round. Then it turns and holds, and you lie there with only your face out in air that would be dangerous if you were standing up in it, listening to a tent wall breathe in and out against the wind. And the two things are perfectly separated by 4 inches of down, and that, apparently, is one of the deepest sleeps a human being can have. Let that be the picture for a moment. The wind outside doing whatever it wants and no obligation whatsoever to go and see about it. You are warm. The pot is full. Nothing needs doing until morning. Fact number 29. At the geographic South Pole, the sun rises once a year and sets once a year, and that is the entire calendar. There is one sunrise around the 21st of September and one sunset around the 21st of March, and between them there is a single day 6 months long, and after them a single night 6 months long. This is not a poetic way of describing long days and short days. It is literally what happens. The Earth is tilted on its axis by about 23.5 degrees. And at the pole that tilt means the sun spends half the year entirely above the horizon and half the year entirely below it. During the long day, the sun does not climb and set. It simply circles the sky, going round and round at the same modest height, completing one full lap every 24 hours, like something patrolling the top of a wall. There is no noon and no evening. The light at breakfast is the light at midnight. People who winter at the pole describe losing all sense of the hour within a fortnight and having to be quite firm with themselves about clocks, because the sky has stopped offering any opinion at all. Fact number 30. The sunset at the pole takes weeks, because the sun is moving almost horizontally rather than dropping. It sinks toward the horizon at an angle so shallow that the act of setting stretches out over an absurd length of time. First, the sun grazes the horizon and pops back up. Then, it spends days half in and half out. Then, it goes under and the sky stays lit anyway. Because twilight at the pole is measured in weeks rather than minutes. There is civil twilight, then nautical twilight, then astronomical twilight, each one lasting a fortnight or more, the light draining out of the sky so gradually that nobody can point to the moment when the day ended. It is the slowest sunset in the solar system that a human being can actually attend, and the people who watch it happen tend to describe it in unusually quiet language, even by the standards of people who have chosen to live on an ice sheet. Fact number 31. Once the long night arrives properly, the darkness is not what people imagine. Absolute blackness is rare. There is starlight, and on the polar plateau the stars are shockingly bright, because there is no dust, no humidity, no pollution, and no town within 1,000 miles to spoil them. There is the moon, which at the pole also behaves strangely, staying up for a fortnight at a time and circling like the sun did. There is the aurora. And there is snow, which reflects every scrap of light it is given, so that on a clear night with a full moon the ice is bright enough to walk on comfortably and to read a large print page by in a cold blue light with no color in it whatsoever. Winter over crews talk about the shock of returning to an ordinary night sky at home afterwards and finding it looked broken, as though most of the stars had been taken away while they were out. Fact number 32. The southern lights, the aurora australis, are the mirror twin of the northern lights, and they often occur at the same moment in almost the same shape. The sun throws out a constant stream of charged particles. The Earth's magnetic field funnels them down toward both magnetic poles, and where they collide with the upper atmosphere, they make it glow. Green from oxygen at lower altitudes, red from oxygen higher up, blue and violet from nitrogen. What surprises people who see it for the first time is the movement. It is not a static colored cloud. It ripples. It folds and unfolds like a curtain in a drought. It runs along its own length. It brightens suddenly and then dims, and it can fill the entire sky rather than sitting politely on the horizon. And it is silent, absolutely silent, which somehow makes it stranger, because everything that large in ordinary life makes a noise. Fact number 33. At the South Pole, the stars do not rise or set. This is one of those facts that sounds like a small technicality until you picture it and realize how odd it is. Everywhere else on Earth, the sky wheels overhead, and stars come up in the east and go down in the west, and the view changes through the night and through the year. At the pole, you are standing on the axis. The sky turns around a point directly above your head, and every star simply goes around in a level circle at the same height above the horizon. Forever, you see exactly 1/2 of the entire celestial sphere, and you see all of it all the time, and the other half you will never see at all. An astronomer at the pole can point a telescope at a single object and watch it continuously for months without it ever setting, which is the reason several remarkable instruments have been dragged at enormous inconvenience to the least convenient address on the planet. Fact number 34. At the geographic South Pole, every direction is north. You cannot walk south. There is no south left. Whichever way you face, whichever way you set off, you are heading north. And if you keep going, you will arrive at the coast, and then eventually at the equator, and eventually at the other pole. Compasses are close to useless there, partly because the magnetic pole is somewhere else entirely, and partly because the magnetic field lines at high latitude are pointing almost straight down into the ground, so a compass needle mostly wants to dive. Navigation is done by sun angle, by satellite, and by a grid system invented specifically so that the people living there could have a shared idea of which way was which without every conversation collapsing into philosophy. Fact number 35. The marker at the geographic South Pole has to be moved every single year, and this is my favorite piece of housekeeping anywhere on Earth. The pole itself is a fixed point on the planet, but the station sits on ice, and that ice is flowing at about 33 feet a year. So every New Year's Day, the surveyors go out, work out where the true pole has got to relative to the drifting station, and plant a new marker in the correct spot. The old marker stays where it is and begins its own long journey downstream, and the previous markers are kept and displayed indoors in a line. By tradition, the new marker is designed and machined by the winter overcrew themselves during the long night when there is time, and each year's is different, a small brass and copper sculpture of a thing they thought about while it was dark. There is a line of them on a wall at the bottom of the world, one for each winter. Each one hand made by people with nothing else to do, marking a point that will not stay still. And here, before we go on, let the shape of that settle for a moment. A station on a plain of ice, drifting a few inches a day, a sky that turns without rising or setting, a sunset that takes a month, and a night that takes 6. Nothing there is in a hurry. Nothing there needs anything from you. Let your breathing go a little slower and let the next fact arrive at whatever speed it likes. Fact number 36. There is one animal that chooses to be out in that 6-month night on purpose with a fragile thing balanced on its feet, and it is the emperor penguin. Emperors are the largest penguins alive, standing about 3 feet 8 inches tall and weighing up to 88 pounds at the start of the season, with a dense double layer of overlapping feathers and a thick pad of fat beneath and a body shape that is almost perfectly designed to keep heat where it is. Their feathers are stiff and short and packed roughly 100 to the square inch. And beneath them lies a layer of down and trapped air that behaves like a wetsuit made of pillows. Their nasal passages recapture most of the heat from their own outgoing breath before it leaves the body. The arteries running to their feet and flippers are wound around the returning veins, so that outgoing warm blood hands its heat to the incoming cold blood, and very little of it escapes at the extremities. The result is an animal whose feet are held only just above freezing, while its core stays comfortably warm, which is why it can stand on ice for months without any apparent complaint. Fact number 37. Every other creature on the continent leaves for the winter, or hides, or sleeps, or goes to sea. The emperor penguin walks the other way. In March and April, as the sun is going down for the last time and the sea ice is beginning to spread outward from the coast, the emperors come out of the water and begin walking inland across the new ice to their breeding grounds, which may be 50 miles from open water. They do not fly, and they are not built for walking, so they alternate, an upright rolling waddle when the surface is rough. And then, when it smooths out, they flop forward onto their bellies and toboggan, pushing with their feet and steering with their flippers, sliding along in a line like a small procession of well-dressed sledges. Nobody is chasing them. Nothing is forcing them out there. They are simply going in single file into the coldest winter on Earth, because that is the only way the timing works. Fact number 38. The reason for that impossible timing is the chick. An emperor chick needs a long time to grow, and it needs to reach the sea as a fledgling exactly when the summer sea ice is breaking up and the water is at its richest. Work backwards from that date, and you find that the egg has to be laid in the middle of winter. So it is. The female lays one single egg in May or June in the dark, weighing about 1 pound, and she never lays another that year. There is no nest because there is nothing to build one out of. There is no burrow because it is all ice. The egg is simply held on the top of the parent's feet and covered by a fold of loose, warm belly skin called the brood pouch. And that is the entire nursery, 2 feet and a flap of skin, and beneath it several thousand feet of ice, and beneath that the sea. Fact number 39. The handover of that egg is the most dangerous minute in the whole enterprise. Once she has laid it, the female is thin and depleted and must return to the sea to feed, so the egg has to be transferred from her feet to the male's. Across the ice, in the dark, at temperatures that will kill it in less than 2 minutes of exposure, both birds shuffle and maneuver, and the egg is rolled and nudged from one pair of feet to another. If it slips onto the ice, or if it takes too long, it is lost, and that is the year gone. Then she leaves, walking back out across the widening ice to the sea, and he stays and does not eat at all. for around 115 days. He arrived carrying his winter weight, and he will leave having lost close to half of it, having stood in one place through the entire polar night, in the dark, in the wind, holding one egg. Fact number 40. To survive that, the males form a huddle, and the huddle is a genuinely astonishing piece of physics. Several thousand males pressed together shoulder to shoulder at about 10 birds to the square yard. And inside that mass the temperature climbs to something like 75 degrees Fahrenheit, even while the air outside is at 50 below. But a static huddle would be unfair. The birds on the windward edge would freeze while the birds in the middle overheated. So the huddle moves. It moves constantly, in small waves. Every 30 to 60 seconds, a bird takes a step about 2 inches long, and that step triggers its neighbors to step, and the movement travels through the whole colony as a slow traveling wave, and the cumulative effect is that the entire huddle drifts downwind, and the birds on the exposed edge are gradually carried around and folded into the warm interior, while the ones in the middle are gradually delivered to the outside. No bird is in charge of this. There is no plan and no signaling. It emerges from a few thousand animals, each making the same small, selfish decision to be slightly warmer, and the result is a system that distributes warmth almost perfectly across every member of it, which is more than can be said for a great many committees. Fact number 41. When the chick hatches, usually before the female has returned, the male has one more trick left. He produces a curd-like secretion from his esophagus, sometimes called crop milk, rich in protein and fat, and he can keep the chick alive on that alone for up to 10 days, having eaten nothing himself since autumn. Then the female comes back across the ice, fat and full of fish, and finds him. And this is the part that people find hard to believe. She finds him by voice, in a crowd of thousands of nearly identical birds in the dark on a featureless plain. Emperors have a two-voiced call, produced by two independent sides of the vocal organ at once, giving each bird a signature made of two overlapping frequencies that is essentially unique. Parents and chicks learn each other's calls and can pick them out through the noise of a colony of 10,000. It is the only address any of them will ever have. Fact number 42. Emperors are also the deepest diving birds in the world by a very wide margin. The record is a dive to 1,850 feet, deeper than most nuclear submarines are willing to go, and dives of 20 minutes or more have been recorded. At that depth, the pressure would crush an air-filled lung, so they do not use one in the way we would. They exhale, dive on the oxygen stored in their blood and muscle rather than in their chest, slow their heart to a few beats a minute, and shut down circulation to everything that is not immediately required. Their bones are solid rather than hollow, which makes them heavy, which for a bird that wants to sink is exactly right. They hunt in water that is a degree or so below the freezing point of fresh water, in the dark, under a lid of ice, and then they come back up a hole they have to remember the location of, and then they walk 50 miles home. And now, since we have the emperors in front of us, let us go slowly through one whole winter of theirs from beginning to end, because it is one of the great quiet epics of this planet, and it happens every single year without any witnesses at all for most of its length. Begin in late summer. The birds are at sea, fat, fast, entirely at home. hunting fish and squid and krill through water at the freezing point, coming up through cracks in the loose ice to breathe. Then the light starts to go, and the sea begins to close over, and something in them turns. They come out of the water onto the new ice, and they begin to walk south, away from the food, toward a place most of them have been before, and some of them have never seen. They arrive at the colony ground, which is a stretch of flat sea ice, usually in the lee of an ice cliff or against a grounded iceberg that will shelter them from the worst of the wind and, crucially, will hold the ice fast in place so that it does not break up and float away with everything on it. Then there is the courtship, which is conducted by voice and by posture. Thousands of birds bowing and calling and standing very tall with their beaks pointed at the sky. Pairs form. The colony settles. The light goes almost entirely. In May or June, in the dark, the egg is laid, and the transfer happens, and the females walk away north toward the sea, and that is the last their partners will see of them for 2 months or more. And then, for the males, there is nothing to do but stand there. Nothing at all. That is the whole task, and it lasts 115 days. No feeding, no shelter, no movement beyond the 2-inch shuffle of the huddle, no daylight, no relief. When a blizzard comes through at 100 miles an hour, they do not move. They turn their backs to it and lower their heads and let the snow build up against them until only a field of white mounds is visible from a distance. They lose more than a third of their body weight. They stand in their own kind of darkness for a third of a year with a single egg balanced on their feet, and they do it because that is the arrangement. And it does not appear to occur to any of them to do otherwise. Then the chick hatches, gray and downy and absurd, and lives on the crop milk for a few days, and then there is a moment which is genuinely one of the most extraordinary things in nature. The female comes back. She has walked over the new ice, sometimes 50 miles or more, having spent 2 months at sea eating everything she could catch, and she arrives at a colony of many thousands of essentially identical birds in a landscape with no landmarks, in the half-dark, and she begins to call. And somewhere in that mass, a bird that has not eaten since autumn hears the one voice in the world it is listening for, and answers, and they find each other. And the chick is handed over, and he leaves immediately and walks north to the sea to eat. From there on the year becomes gentler. The parents alternate, one at the colony and one at sea, and the trips get shorter as the sun comes back and the ice edge retreats closer. The chicks grow and are eventually left in groups called Kirches, where they huddle together with the same shuffling logic their fathers used, minded loosely by a few adults, while both parents fish. They are noisy. They are extremely comic. They fall over a great deal. And then, in December, as the sea ice begins to break up beneath them, the young birds molt out of their down and into waterproof feathers, and the ice they are standing on starts to come apart and float, and they go into the sea for the very first time on a piece of the colony floor that has detached itself and taken them out to the open water, which is either the most elegant piece of timing in the natural world or a coincidence that has been repeated so often it has become a plan. Around half of them will survive their first year. The ones that do will spend 4 or 5 years at sea before they come back, and then one autumn the light will start to fail and something will turn in them, and they will climb out onto the new ice and start walking inland, and they will not be able to say why. Hold that image for a while as you settle. It is dark down there right now. Somewhere on the fast ice against a cliff, several thousand large birds are standing pressed together in a slowly rotating crowd, each of them taking a small step every minute or so, sharing out the warmth without any of them intending to, holding the next generation off the ice on the tops of their feet. There is no sun, and there will not be one for weeks. The aurora is probably going silently overhead, and they are simply waiting it out patiently in the cold, doing the one thing that is required of them, which is to stay. Fact number 43. For a long time, nobody knew where most of the emperor colonies were, and then somebody had the excellent idea of looking for the mess rather than the birds. An emperor colony sits in one place for months, and several thousand penguins living in one place for months leave a very large, very obvious brown stain on the ice. From orbit, individual penguins are far too small to see, but a guano stain half a mile across is unmistakable, and it is the wrong color for anything else down there, because almost nothing on that continent is brown. So researchers began searching satellite imagery of the entire Antarctic coastline for brown smudges, and they found colonies nobody had ever visited, in places nobody had ever landed, including several that had never appeared on any map or in any expedition record. The current count of known emperor colonies stands at over 60, and a good number of them were discovered by people sitting at desks in temperate countries, scrolling patiently through pictures of a white coastline looking for a stain. It is not the most romantic method of exploration ever devised, but it is extremely effective, and it means the last great census of a large animal on this planet was carried out largely by noticing where it had been untidy. Fact number 44. The other penguin you will meet on the Antarctic mainland is the Adley, which is smaller, brisker, and considerably more argumentative. Adleys stand about 2 feet tall, wear the classic dinner jacket coloring with a distinctive white ring around each eye, and unlike emperors, they breed in the summer. In colonies that can run to hundreds of thousands of birds on the few bare stony beaches and headlands the continent allows them, their nests are made of pebbles. This matters enormously, because a nest of pebbles lifts the eggs an inch or two above the meltwater that pools on the ground when the sun is up, and an egg sitting in cold water does not hatch. Suitable pebbles are therefore the most valuable commodity in the colony. Birds carry them one at a time in their beaks, sometimes from a considerable distance, and build a small raised platform of them and then defend it, because a certain proportion of the colony has worked out that it is far quicker to steal a pebble from a neighbor than to walk half a mile and find one. Watching an Adley colony is watching several 100,000 small, formal-looking birds conducting an unending, extremely loud dispute about gravel, and it is one of the great comic spectacles of the natural world, though the participants do not appear to find it funny at all. Fact number 45. Beneath the sea ice, in complete darkness for months at a time, there are seals living an entirely different kind of Antarctic winter. Weddell seals are the southernmost breeding mammal on Earth, and they stay under the ice all winter rather than migrating away, which raises an obvious problem. They breathe air, and the ceiling above them is solid. They solve it with their teeth. A Weddell seal maintains its own breathing holes by reaming and rasping at the ice around them with its upper incisors and canines, sawing the hole open again and again as it tries to freeze shut, sometimes through several feet of ice. This works, and it keeps the animal alive, and it also slowly destroys its teeth, which is ultimately what limits how long a Weddell seal lives. When the teeth are worn down past use, the seal can no longer keep a hole open, and its winter under the ice comes to an end. It is a very quiet, very undramatic sort of bargain, a whole life spent under a frozen roof, paid for one tooth at a time. In the dark, under thick ice, they call to each other in long descending whistles and chirps and trills that carry for miles through the water, and the recordings sound less like an animal than like a piece of electronic music somebody left running by accident. Fact number 46. The animal that actually holds the Antarctic together is about 2.5 inches long. Antarctic krill are small, translucent, shrimp-like crustaceans with black bead eyes and a faint internal glow, and there are somewhere in the region of 400 trillion of them. By total mass, they are one of the most abundant animal species on the planet, and quite possibly the most abundant of any species of that size. They gather in swarms so dense that the water turns a rusty pink and so vast that they are visible from satellites and register on ship sonar as a false seabed. A single swarm can stretch for miles and contain more individual animals than there are stars you could count in a lifetime. Almost everything in the Southern Ocean eats them, directly or one step removed: penguins, seals, squid, fish, albatrosses, and the great whales. They in turn eat the microscopic algae that grow on the underside of the sea ice, which means the entire food web of a continent rests, ultimately, on a film of green slime clinging to the bottom of the ice, which is a humbling thought and also completely true. Fact number 47. Because of the krill, the Southern Ocean in summer feeds the largest animals that have ever existed. Blue whales come south to gorge, and a blue whale is not merely big, it is a category error up to about 98 feet long and 190 tons, with a heart the size of a small car and a tongue that weighs as much as an elephant. It feeds by lunging into a swarm with its mouth open, engulfing a volume of water and krill greater than its own body, then straining the water out through curtains of baleen and swallowing what is left. And it may take several tons of krill in a single day. Humpbacks come too, and fin whales and minkies, and they come for a few months and eat almost continuously, and then leave again for warmer water where the food is far worse, but the calves will survive. The whole Southern Ocean operates as an enormous seasonal restaurant that opens for a few months a year and is then shut by ice. And half the great whales of the planet arrange their entire lives around its opening hours. Fact number 48. On land, the largest permanent resident is a wingless midge about 1/4 of an inch long. Its name is Belgica antarctica, and it is the only insect native to the Antarctic mainland, and it is therefore, technically and hilariously, the largest purely terrestrial animal on the continent. Everything bigger than it that lives there, every penguin and seal and seabird, is really a marine animal that comes ashore to breed and would starve to death if the sea were taken away. The midge would not. It spends 2 years as a larva in damp moss and algae, surviving being frozen solid, surviving losing most of the water in its body, surviving the entire winter under snow, and then emerges as an adult for about 10 days, during which it does not eat at all, because it has no functioning mouthparts and no time for that sort of thing. It has no wings, which is sensible, since anything with wings in that wind would be in another country by lunchtime. It mates, it lays, it dies. And the continent's largest land animal has completed its life without ever once traveling further than a few feet from where it hatched. Fact number 49. There is a small white bird that nests further from the sea than seems reasonable. The snow petrel is entirely white apart from a black bill and black eyes, and it looks, against the ice, like a piece of the landscape that has decided to fly. It nests in crevices in bare rock, and some of those nesting sites are 200 miles inland up on Nunataks, which are the isolated peaks of buried mountains poking through the ice sheet like the tops of drowned buildings. To feed, the parent bird must fly the whole 200 miles back to open water, catch krill and small fish, and fly 200 miles home again. What makes those nest sites remarkable is that they have been used continuously for a very long time. The birds regurgitate a waxy stomach oil, and over the centuries that oil accumulates around the nest crevice, hardening into a dark, glossy deposit that can be dated. Some of these deposits show that snow petrels have been nesting on the same rock in the same crack for over 30,000 years, which means these particular nests were in use during the last ice age and are older than agriculture, older than pottery, older than every city that has ever existed, and they are still, tonight, occupied. Fact number 50. Antarctica has exactly 2 native flowering plants, and both of them live only on the milder Antarctic Peninsula and the nearby islands. One is Antarctic hairgrass, a small tufted grass that grows in sheltered pockets among the rocks. The other is Antarctic pearwort, a low cushion plant with tiny yellow flowers. That is the entire native flora of flowering plants for a continent larger than Europe, 2 species, both of them modest, both of them clinging to the warmest sliver of the coldest place on earth. Everything else that grows there is a moss, a liverwort, an alga, or a lichen. There are no trees, no shrubs, no ferns, no reeds, nothing with a woody stem, nothing taller than your ankle. And both of those 2 flowering species have been spreading in recent decades as the peninsula has warmed, which is one of the very few pieces of Antarctic news that arrives in the shape of something growing rather than something breaking. Fact number 51. The real success stories of Antarctic land life are things you need a microscope to introduce yourself to. There are nematode worms in the frozen soil, and mites and springtails, and there are tardigrades, the microscopic 8-legged animals sometimes called water bears, which are perhaps the single most stubborn form of life yet discovered. When conditions turn against them, a tardigrade curls into a barrel shape called a tun, expels almost all the water in its body, replaces it with a protective sugar and a set of specialized proteins that turn its insides to glass, and stops. It does not slow down. It stops. Metabolism becomes undetectable. In that state, it can survive being frozen to nearly absolute zero, being boiled, being exposed to the vacuum and radiation of open space, and being kept dry for decades. Put a drop of water on it, and after a while it uncurls and carries on with whatever it was doing, apparently without resentment. In Antarctica, this is not an exotic laboratory trick. It is Tuesday, the soil freezes solid, everything in it stops, the soil thaws, everything in it resumes. Fact number 52. Lichens are the great survivors of the exposed rock. And they are not one organism, but 2 living as one, a fungus providing the structure and the water holding, and an alga or a cyanobacterium inside it providing food by photosynthesis. Antarctic lichens grow at a pace that makes glaciers look impulsive. Some species add less than 1/100th of an inch a year. A patch the size of a saucer may have been growing for 1,000 years. And there are Antarctic lichens estimated at several thousand years old, which makes some of the dull green and orange crusts on those rocks older than the pyramids and considerably older than most nations. They photosynthesize at temperatures well below freezing, they can shut down entirely for years without dying, and they will restart within minutes of being given a little moisture and a little light. Nearly 400 species of them have been recorded down there, and between them, they are the closest thing the continent has to a forest. Fact number 53. There are no polar bears in Antarctica, and there never have been. This is worth saying plainly because a surprising number of otherwise well-informed people carry an image of a polar bear standing beside a penguin, and no such photograph has ever been taken outside a zoo or an advertisement. Polar bears are Arctic animals. From the top of the world, penguins are almost entirely southern. The two groups are separated by the entire width of the planet and have never met. In fact, Antarctica has no native land mammals at all. No bears, no foxes, no hares, no lemmings, no reindeer, nothing. The Arctic, by contrast, is a frozen ocean surrounded by continents, so land animals can walk there. Antarctica is a continent surrounded by an ocean and a wall of current, and nothing that walks has ever managed to arrive. Fact number 54. The absence of land predators has left the wildlife with a peculiar quality that visitors find unsettling and then rather moving. Nothing there is afraid of you. A penguin approached by a person does not run. It looks at you, tilts its head, and quite often walks closer to have a better look, because nothing in its evolutionary history has ever suggested that a large, upright shape on the ice is a problem. Seals lie where they are and open one eye. Skuas will land a few feet away and consider you at length. There is no flight response because there has never been anything to flee from on land. Modern rules require people to keep their distance, and quite right too. But the rules only bind one side of the arrangement, and the animals have not read them, and a curious penguin that has decided to inspect your boots is a situation with no lawful solution except to stand very still and wait to be released. Before we leave the living things behind and walk into the driest valleys on earth, it is worth sitting for a moment with the thing that everybody who has been there mentions first, and which no photograph has ever managed to carry home, and that is the silence. In most of the places you have ever been quiet, there was still something going on. There were birds, or a road 2 miles away, or wind in leaves, or a refrigerator, or the small oceanic sound of your own house settling. In the interior of Antarctica, there is none of that, because there is nothing there to make a sound. There are no leaves, because there are no trees. There are no insects. There are no birds inland. There is no running water for most of the year, and no traffic, and no machinery unless somebody has brought it, and no animals of any kind for hundreds of miles. On a still day on the plateau, the sound level drops to something close to the limit of human hearing, and what people report is that they begin to hear themselves, the blood in their own ears, the faint creak of their own joints, the fabric of their own coat, and, unnervingly, their own heartbeat, which most of us go a whole lifetime without hearing unaided. Field parties have described taking their hood down and standing still and finding the experience genuinely difficult, not because it was frightening, but because it was so completely unfamiliar that the mind kept looking for something and not finding it. Sound also behaves strangely out there, when there is any. Cold, dense air near the surface bends sound waves downward instead of letting them escape upward, so noises carry much further than they should. A conversation can be understood at several hundred yards. The clink of a shovel against a fuel drum can be heard a mile off. Voices arrive from directions nobody is standing in. In the early expeditions, this caused real confusion, with men calling to each other across a plain and hearing replies that seemed to come from somewhere quite different, and there are accounts of parties in the field convinced that another group was nearby when the nearest human being was 100 miles away. And then there is the light, which does something similar. Because the air is so clear and there is nothing in the landscape whose size you know, distance becomes almost impossible to judge. There are no trees to compare, no buildings, no roads, no telephone poles, no sheep. A mountain that looks like a modest hill an hour's walk away turns out to be 9,000 feet high and 3 days off. A dark speck that looks like a boulder a mile out resolves, when reached, into a fuel drum left by somebody in 1960. Explorers have set off to walk to a nearby ridge and given up at nightfall, having got no closer. The whole continent quietly refuses to give you the ordinary cues you have used to measure the world since you were a small child, and it does it without any malice at all, simply by being empty. Perhaps the strangest version of that is what happens to a person's sense of scale about themselves. Almost everyone who has spent time in the deep field says some version of the same thing afterwards, in slightly embarrassed language, because it sounds grand and they do not want to sound grand. What they say is that being in a landscape which is completely indifferent to you turns out to be restful rather than frightening. Nothing out there wants anything from you. Nothing is watching. Nothing needs a decision. The ice does not care whether you succeed, and it does not care whether you go home. And it has been getting on perfectly well for 34 million years without any input from anybody. And after the first few days of finding that unsettling, most people find that it takes a weight off them that they had not noticed they were carrying. So imagine that for a moment, a flat white plain in a low gold light going out to a horizon with nothing on it. No sound at all, not one, except your own breathing, which you can hear more clearly than you ever have. Air so clear that a mountain range 50 miles away looks close enough to walk to before lunch, and absolutely nothing that requires anything of you in any direction for further than you can imagine. Let your shoulders drop into that. Nothing on that plain is waiting for you to do something about it. And now let us go over the mountains into the valleys where even the ice has been taken away. Fact number 55. Now we come to the strangest corner of the whole continent, and it is strange precisely because there is no ice in it at all, tucked between the Transantarctic Mountains and the Ross Sea. On the far side of the range from the Great Plateau, there is a set of broad, dry, brown valleys with bare gravel floors and steep rock walls and not one flake of snow lying in them. They are called the McMurdo Dry Valleys. They cover around 1,900 square miles, and they are the largest ice-free region on the continent. Standing in one of them, you would see loose stones, drifted sand, dark ridges, a hard blue sky, and a landscape that looks less like a polar region than like a photograph of somewhere the atmosphere forgot. There is no vegetation you can see with the naked eye. There is no soil in the ordinary sense. There is no water on the surface for most of the year, and there is no sound except wind, which arrives dry and warm and takes away anything it can lift. Fact number 56. The reason they are dry is a piece of geography working exactly like a machine. The Transantarctic Mountains stand between the valleys and the enormous ice sheet behind them, and they are high enough to block the ice from flowing through. The ice simply cannot get over the range, so it goes around. Meanwhile, the katabatic wind, sliding down off the plateau, is squeezed through the gaps in those mountains, and as it descends it is compressed, and compressed air warms up. By the time that wind reaches the valley floors, having dropped thousands of feet, it has warmed by tens of degrees, and its humidity has collapsed. And a warm, dry wind arriving in a cold, dry place does exactly one thing. It takes moisture away. It removes snow without melting it, turning ice directly into vapor, a process called sublimation. Any snow that falls is gone within days. The valleys are not dry because it never snows on them. They are dry because they are being continuously wiped clean by their own weather. Fact number 57. Some of that ground has been dry for a very long time. Certain surfaces in the highest of the dry valleys are thought to have been exposed, unfrozen by any glacier and unwetted by any rain for millions of years. There are patches of ancient buried ice in Beacon Valley that some researchers have argued are around 8 million years old, which would make them the oldest ice known anywhere on Earth. And the debate about that number has been running for decades with a pleasant intensity that only a very slow argument about a very old thing can sustain. Either way, these are the least changing landscapes on the planet. Move a stone in one of those valleys and you may well have made the largest alteration to that particular square yard of ground since before there were human beings, which is why the rules about where people may walk there are stricter than almost anywhere else on Earth. Fact number 58. In the summer, for a few weeks, a small amount of glacial ice at the head of the valleys does melt. And Antarctica gets a river. The longest is the Onyx River, which runs for about 20 miles along the floor of the Wright Valley, and it has two peculiarities. The first is that it flows inland, away from the sea, because that is the way the valley tilts. The second is that it exists only for a few weeks each summer, and only when it feels like it. Some years it runs strongly for 2 months. Some years it barely runs at all, and it has been measured and monitored for decades by people who have come to regard its moods as a kind of local personality. It carries no fish. It has no plants along its banks. It empties into a lake with no outlet, where the water simply evaporates and leaves behind everything it was carrying. It is a river with no ecosystem, running the wrong way for a fortnight in a desert on the coldest continent on Earth. Fact number 59. At the western end of the Wright Valley, there is a shallow pond, only a few inches deep and a few hundred yards across, called Don Juan Pond, and it is the saltiest body of water known on this planet. It is a calcium chloride brine, saturated to somewhere above 40% salt by weight, which is roughly 12 times saltier than seawater and considerably saltier than the Dead Sea. Because of that, it does not freeze. Air temperatures there routinely fall to 50 below, and the pond sits there in the open, unfrozen, faintly steaming, with white crusts of salt around its edges and nothing living in it at all. It is the only naturally occurring place on Earth where a mineral called Antarcticite forms. Planetary scientists are extremely interested in it because brines like this one are the sort of thing that might allow liquid water to persist on the surface of Mars. And if you want to know what a puddle on another planet might behave like, this small, unremarkable pond at the end of a dry valley is the best model available. Fact number 60. And then there is Blood Falls, which is precisely what it sounds like. At the snout of the Taylor Glacier, a rust-red stain pours out of the white ice and spreads down onto the frozen surface of the lake below. And it looks exactly like a wound. When it was first seen in 1911, the discoverers assumed the color came from red algae, because that was the only sensible guess available. It is not algae, it is iron. Sealed beneath that glacier, cut off from the atmosphere for well over 1 million years, there is a reservoir of ancient brine, extremely salty, extremely cold, entirely without oxygen and heavily loaded with dissolved iron. Where it finds a crack and seeps out into the air, the iron oxidizes instantly on contact with oxygen and rusts, and the water turns red as it emerges. What makes it extraordinary is not the color, though. It is that the brain is inhabited. There is a community of microbes living down there in the sealed dark. With no light and no oxygen and no fresh food, running an entire metabolism on iron and sulfur, and they have been doing so, quietly sealed off, for something like 1.5 million years. And here, let that image stay with you for a while, since we are going to be spending the rest of the night underneath things. A valley with no ice. A river that runs backwards for a fortnight. A pond too salty to freeze. And a glacier with a slow red stain at its foot, leaking a sealed world into the daylight 1 drop at a time. Fact number 61. Scattered across the floors of the dry valleys, sometimes 30 or 40 miles inland and thousands of feet above sea level, there are the bodies of seals. They are lying on the open gravel, well away from any water. Dried and hardened and largely intact, with skin like old leather stretched over the bones, and in some cases the whiskers and claws are still in place. Nobody is entirely certain why they went there. The likeliest explanation is that they became disorientated, hauled out onto the ice, and simply set off in the wrong direction, up a valley instead of back to the sea, and kept going until they stopped. What happened next is the interesting part. In an ordinary climate, a carcass is gone within weeks, taken apart by scavengers and bacteria and weather. In the dry valleys, there are no scavengers of any size, almost no bacteria that can operate at that dryness, and no moisture, so nothing decays. The bodies simply dry out and stay. Radiocarbon dates on some of them run to hundreds and even thousands of years, and there are candidates that may be older still. They are not fossils. They are not buried. They are just lying there in the open air, in a landscape with no smell, being slowly polished by wind-blown sand in a place where the ordinary business of rotting has been suspended indefinitely. Fact number 62. That same wind-blown sand does something remarkable to the stones. With almost no rain to soften them and a hard, steady wind carrying sharp grains at speed, the rocks of the dry valleys are sandblasted into shapes that look deliberate. They are called ventifacts, and they come out of the process faceted, grooved, pitted, hollowed, and polished. Sometimes carved into arches and honeycombs and blades, sometimes cut into flat planes that meet at edges as clean as anything struck by a mason. Some of them are hollowed out to a shell an inch thick, with a smooth interior and a fluted rim, and they ring faintly if you tap them. The whole valley floor is scattered with these things, dark, shining, sculptural. Made by nothing but wind and grit and an enormous amount of time. Photographs of them are routinely mistaken for archaeology, which is understandable, because they look far too intentional to be an accident, and there is no other explanation available in a place with no people. Fact number 63. Life in the dry valleys did not give up. It moved inside the rocks. If you pick up a piece of the pale sandstone there and crack it open, you will often see a band of color a fraction of an inch below the surface, a green layer, sometimes with black and white bands above and below it. That is a living community, and it is called a cryptoendolithic community, which simply means hidden inside stone. Algae, fungi, and cyanobacteria have colonized the microscopic pore spaces between the sand grains, deep enough to be sheltered from the wind and the killing dryness and the ultraviolet light, but shallow enough that a trace of daylight still filters through the translucent quartz above them. There, in the gaps inside a rock, in a valley where nothing visible grows. There is photosynthesis happening. These communities may be metabolically active for only a few hundred hours in a year, when a little moisture and a little warmth coincide, and they may take thousands of years to do what a garden weed does in a season. But they are alive, and they have been alive in that stone for a very long time. Fact number 64. All of this is why the dry valleys have been treated for 60 years as the nearest available copy of Mars. The combination is almost unique on Earth. Extreme cold, extreme dryness, salty soils, thin films of brine, ultraviolet exposure, oxidizing ground chemistry, and life that survives only by hiding inside rock or inside brine. When the Viking landers were being built in the 1970s, their life detection experiments were tested in these valleys first, on the reasonable grounds that if an instrument could not find life in Antarctic soil that definitely contained some, it was not going to distinguish itself on another planet. Rovers have been trialed there. Drilling systems designed for Martian ice have been rehearsed there. And the reasoning runs the other way, too. Every time something turns out to be living somewhere in those valleys that have been written off as sterile, the estimate of where life might be possible elsewhere quietly widens. Fact number 65. There are lakes in the dry valleys, and they are permanently capped with ice. And beneath the cap, they behave in ways lakes are not supposed to. Because the ice lid seals the water off from wind, nothing mixes. The water column simply settles into layers and stays there, sometimes for thousands of years, each layer with its own temperature, its own salinity, and its own chemistry, sitting on top of the next like colored liquids in a glass. In Lake Vanda, the deep water sits at around 75 degrees Fahrenheit, warmer than the air above it by 100 degrees, warmed by sunlight that passes through the clear ice and is trapped underneath by the salt gradient. Lake Vida, further along, is frozen through to a depth of over 60 feet, and beneath that plug there is a brine 7 times saltier than seawater. At around 18 degrees Fahrenheit, with no oxygen, cut off from the atmosphere for at least 2,800 years, and full of bacteria that are somehow still going. Fact number 66. And that idea of sealed water with something living in it is not confined to a few small lakes at the edge of a valley. It turns out to be one of the largest features of the entire continent, and it is happening right now, 2 miles below the surface across thousands of square miles. Because underneath the ice sheet, where the pressure is enormous and the heat of the earth is slowly leaking upward, the ice does not stay frozen all the way down. The bottom melts, and the water that melts there has nowhere to go and nothing to disturb it, and so it collects in basins and hollows in the buried bedrock, and it forms lakes, real lakes, with shores and depths and currents and sediment, sealed under a lid of ice thicker than most mountains are tall, in absolute darkness and, in some cases, undisturbed for millions of years. Nobody suspected they were there. There is nothing on the surface to suggest it. You could stand directly above one of the largest lakes on the planet and see nothing but flat white snow in every direction to the horizon, and hear nothing at all. So let us go and stand on top of one of them for a moment, because it is a very strange thing to picture and a very peaceful one. To get there, you would fly inland from the coast for hours in a ski-equipped aircraft, over a surface that stops offering anything to look at after the first 100 miles, and then you would land on a strip of snow marked out with flags and nothing else. Or you would travel overland with a traverse, a train of tracked vehicles hauling sledges of fuel and living modules, moving at about the speed of a brisk walk, 10 or 12 hours a day for weeks, with somebody up front on a snowmobile watching the ground for the faint shadowed lines that mean a crevasse underneath. Either way, you arrive at a place that looks precisely like every other place. Flat, white, a slight sheen where the wind has polished the surface. Long, low ridges of hard snow a few inches high, all lying parallel, carved by the wind into shapes with their own name, sastrugi, and they are the only texture in the entire visible world, and they will rattle your teeth for 100 miles if you are driving. The horizon is a clean line, and it is a very long way off, and there is nothing on it. And underneath you, 2.5 miles down, there is a lake the size of a county. You cannot feel it. There is no vibration, no sound, no warmth, no hollow note underfoot, no shimmer, no sign of any kind. If nobody had ever flown a radar over that spot, you would have no reason whatsoever to think anything was there. That is what makes it such an odd thing to stand above. Every other great lake on earth announces itself. You can see it from the hills, you can smell it, birds fly to it, towns arrange themselves along its edge, boats leave from it. This one has no shore anybody has walked, no surface anybody has seen, no reflection, no weather, and no name in any local language, because there is no local. It has a designation on a chart, and it has a shape drawn in dotted lines by somebody working from echoes, and that is the entirety of its public existence. It is one of the largest lakes on the planet, and it is completely invisible from the only place a person can stand to look for it. And it is not empty. That is the part that stays with you. There is water down there, very cold and under enormous pressure, moving slowly in a circulation driven by the ceiling melting on one side and freezing on the other. There is sediment on the bottom, layered, thousands of feet of it in places, holding a record of everything that has drifted down through the water since it was sealed. There are, in all likelihood, currents that have run in the same direction for 1 million years. And in it there are things that are alive, chemical, patient, minute, running a metabolism on iron and sulfur and rock dust and the faint heat of the planet, in absolute darkness, with no sunlight ever and no seasons, and no idea whatsoever that there is a sky. They have never encountered anything that photosynthesizes. They have never encountered oxygen in any quantity. They have been doubling, very slowly, perhaps once a century, for longer than our species has existed. And this is why people who study those lakes speak about them so carefully, and why they went to such extraordinary lengths to melt their way in with sterilized water rather than drilling with kerosene. Once you have contaminated a sealed environment, it is not sealed, and it never will be again, and you cannot put it back. There are lakes down there that have been deliberately left alone, that nobody will touch in our lifetimes on the grounds that we are not yet good enough at not spoiling things and that the lake will keep. It is a rare and rather admirable form of restraint, an entire body of water of enormous scientific value left unopened on purpose, because the people best placed to open it decided the right time was later. So picture the surface again, a plain of hard white snow with parallel ridges a few inches high in a light that has no direction to it. A wind that has been blowing the same way for 10,000 years, a sky going deep blue overhead, and underneath, straight down, further than most aircraft ever climb. A black lake with a slow current in it and something alive in the water, undisturbed, unlit, unvisited, and getting on perfectly well. There is nothing you need to do about that either. It is managed for 15 million years without any assistance, and it will manage tonight. Fact number 67. The largest of those buried lakes is Lake Vostok, and it lies under about 2.5 miles of ice in the middle of East Antarctica, directly beneath the Russian research station that recorded the coldest temperature on Earth. It is roughly 155 miles long and 30 miles wide, with a maximum depth of around 2,900 feet, which makes it comparable in surface area to Lake Ontario and considerably deeper. It has a shoreline. It has a ridge dividing it into two basins. It has, in all likelihood, currents driven by the slow melting of the ice ceiling on one side and refreezing on the other. And every part of it is in absolute, permanent, total darkness, and has been for somewhere between 15 and 25 million years. When it was sealed off, there were no humans anywhere in the world, and there would not be for a very long time. Whales were still developing into the forms we recognize. Australia was still moving into position. That lake has simply been sitting there through all of it, in the dark, under the ice, unaware of every single thing that has happened above it. Fact number 68. The way it was found is a lovely piece of accidental science, and it happened in stages over decades. In the 1960s and 70s, aircraft began flying long survey lines across the plateau with radar systems that could see through ice. Ice is largely transparent to radio waves at the right frequency, so a pulse sent down will pass through thousands of feet of it and bounce off whatever is at the bottom. Bedrock returns a rough, ragged, uneven echo. But over one particular region, the echo came back flat, strong and mirror smooth, over an area far too large to be anything sensible. Then somebody noticed that the surface of the ice sheet above that area was also unusually flat, over an enormous distance, which is what an ice sheet does when it is floating on something rather than dragging over rock. Then satellite altimetry confirmed the flatness with precision. A flat mirror at the bottom, a flat surface at the top, and no explanation except the obvious one. The ice there was not resting on the ground. It was floating on water. Fact number 69. The obvious question is how liquid water can exist at the bottom of a 2-mile ice sheet in the coldest place on Earth. And there are two answers working together. The first is pressure. The freezing point of water is not fixed. It falls as pressure rises, and beneath 2.5 miles of ice, the pressure is around 350 times atmospheric, which lowers the freezing point by several degrees. The second is heat from below. The Earth's interior is warm, and there is a steady trickle of geothermal heat coming up out of the bedrock everywhere on the planet, and normally it is negligible because it escapes into the air. Here it cannot escape because there is a 2-mile blanket of ice over it, and ice is a superb insulator. So the heat accumulates at the base, and combined with the depressed freezing point, it is enough. The water at the bottom of Lake Vostok sits at around 27 degrees Fahrenheit, which is below the ordinary freezing point of fresh water, and is nevertheless liquid, and has been for millions of years. Fact number 70. Vostok is not alone. It is simply the largest member of a hidden system that turned out to be far bigger than anyone expected. More than 600 subglacial lakes have now been identified under the Antarctic ice sheet, ranging from small ponds a few hundred yards across up to the Great Basins, and they are not all separate. Satellites measuring the height of the ice surface to within a few inches began noticing something peculiar in the 2000s. Patches of the ice sheet, some of them many miles across, were slowly sinking by several feet over a couple of years, and then slowly rising again, and elsewhere the opposite was happening at the same time. The only sensible interpretation was that water was draining out of one buried lake and arriving in another, which means there are rivers down there. Not metaphorical rivers, actual channels of flowing water beneath thousands of feet of ice, moving between lakes on timescales of months and years, with floods and surges and quiet periods, an entire hydrological system with weather of its own, mapped from orbit by watching the roof of it breathe. Fact number 71. Reaching into one of those lakes without ruining it turned out to be one of the hardest engineering problems in modern science, and the reason is contamination. If you drill 2 miles down using ordinary methods, you must fill the borehole with fluid to stop it closing under pressure. And that fluid is usually kerosene and antifreeze, and if any of it reaches a body of water that has been isolated for millions of years, then whatever you find afterwards is worthless, because you will never be able to prove you did not bring it with you. The Russian team at Vostok drilled for over 20 years, stopping deliberately a few hundred feet short of the water while the ethics and the engineering were argued over, and when they finally broke through in 2012, water rushed up the hole, froze, and was recovered as a plug of refrozen lake ice. It was suggestive. It was not clean. The American teams that later reached Lake Willans and in Mercer's subglacial lake took a different route entirely, melting their way down with a jet of filtered, ultraviolet sterilist hot water, so that the only thing that ever touched the lake was clean water from the ice sheet itself. It worked. Fact number 72. What they found in both cases was life. Lake Willans, sealed under half a mile of West Antarctic ice, turned out to contain a thriving microbial ecosystem, something like 4,000 distinct types of microorganism at concentrations of around 130,000 cells per milliliter, which is not a trace and not a contaminant, but a functioning community. There is no sunlight down there, so nothing lives on photosynthesis. Instead, these organisms make their living chemically, drawing energy from ammonium and iron and sulfur compounds ground out of the bedrock by the ice above them, running an entire food web on rock and pressure and darkness. At Mercer Subglacial Lake in 2019, the sediment cores brought up something even stranger, the remains of tiny animals, crustaceans and a tardigrade, and what appeared to be fragments of small worms hundreds of miles from the open ocean under half a mile of ice. Whether they lived there recently or were carried in long ago from a sea that once reached further inland is still being argued. And it is exactly the kind of argument that takes a generation to settle. And there, for a moment, let that be the picture you hold. A dark lake the size of a county, 2.5 miles beneath your feet, with a slow current turning in it, and something alive in the water, and above it a plain of white snow with nobody on it for 600 miles, and above that a sky full of stars that never rise and never set. Fact number 73. The ice above those lakes is not only a lid, it is a library, and it is arranged in perfect chronological order, and Antarctica is the only place on Earth that keeps one this complete. Every year a small quantity of snow falls on the plateau. It never melts, so it is never rearranged. Next year's snow falls on top of it and presses it down a little. The year after, a little more. Over centuries, the snow at depth is squeezed into a granular material called firn, and then into solid ice, and the layers stay in sequence, thinning as they go deeper, but never mixing. One year sitting on top of the year before it, all the way down. Near the surface, you can still see the individual years as faint bands, in the same way that you can count the rings of a tree. Because summer snow and winter snow have slightly different crystal structures and slightly different chemistry. Deeper down the bands become too thin to see, and then they are counted by chemistry instead, measuring the annual rise and fall of dust and acidity and the ratio of oxygen isotopes with instruments sensitive enough to resolve a single season in a slice of ice thinner than a coin. What you are looking at when you look at a well-lit Antarctic ice core in a cold laboratory is time itself, stacked up in order in a cylinder about 4 inches across. Fact number 74. The truly extraordinary part is the air. As snow turns to ice, the spaces between the grains close off and seal, and what gets sealed inside is the atmosphere of that year, actual air, trapped in bubbles from a particular winter, kept under pressure and unchanged ever since. When a core is brought into a laboratory and warmed slightly, those bubbles pop, audibly, sometimes hard enough to crack the ice, and when they do, you can catch the gas and measure it. This means we do not have to estimate what the atmosphere was like in the distant past. We have samples of it. We can measure exactly how much carbon dioxide and methane there was in the air over Antarctica 800,000 years ago, because that air is sitting right there in a freezer, in a bubble, waiting. No other archive on this planet does that. Sediments and corals and tree rings all give indirect evidence. The ice gives you the thing itself. And when researchers plotted those measurements against the temperature record from the same core, the two curves rose and fell together, step for step, over 8 full glacial cycles, which is one of those results that changes an entire field in an afternoon. Fact number 75. The longest continuous record so far comes from a project called Epica, drilled at Dome Concordia in East Antarctica, which reached about 10,500 feet down and pulled up ice around 800,000 years old. 800,000 years is a remarkable stretch of time to hold in one column. It contains 8 complete ice ages and 8 warm periods between them. It contains the eruption of every large volcano in that span, each one leaving a thin acid layer and sometimes a dusting of ash that can be chemically fingerprinted to a specific mountain on the other side of the world. It contains dust blown over from the deserts of Patagonia, thicker in the cold, dry glacial periods, thinner in the warm, wet ones. It contains sea salt from storms and traces of forest fires. and the isotopic signature of how far the water in each snowflake traveled before it fell. The bottom of that core was ice that formed before Homo sapiens existed, at a time when our ancestors were still working out fire, and it has been sitting undisturbed under the plateau ever since, quietly recording, with nobody to read it until about 20 years ago. Fact number 76. There is now a serious effort to go further back, and it has a very plain name: Beyond Epoca. The target is ice 1.5 million years old, and the reason is a specific mystery. Somewhere around 1 million years ago, the rhythm of the ice ages changed. Before that, glacial cycles ran on a beat of roughly 41,000 years. Afterwards, they switched to a beat of roughly 100,000 years and became more severe. Nobody is certain why, and the honest answer is that we do not have the air from that period to check. So a drilling camp has been established at a site called Little Dome C, chosen after years of radar surveys hunting for a patch of ice where the layers at the bottom are old, undisturbed, and not melting away against the bedrock, which is a much rarer combination than it sounds. Working through summer seasons at 11,000 feet in a tent camp on a plateau, a team is drilling down through nearly 9,000 feet of ice, one section at a time, to reach a few final feet of extremely compressed material in which a single inch may represent thousands of years. Fact number 77. Antarctica is also absurdly the best place on Earth to collect meteorites, and the ice sheet does most of the work. Rocks fall out of the sky at roughly the same rate everywhere on the planet, but almost everywhere else they land in grass or forest or ocean or desert and are lost, weathered, buried, or indistinguishable from the local stones. In Antarctica, a meteorite lands on snow and is buried, and then it travels with the ice. Sometimes for tens of thousands of years, until the flow of the ice sheet carries it up against the transantarctic mountains. There the ice is blocked and forced upward, and the dry katabatic wind scours away the surface as fast as it rises, removing the ice by sublimation and leaving behind everything it was carrying. The result is a blue ice field, a wind-polished expanse of ancient exposed ice with dark stones lying loose on top of it, concentrated by a conveyor belt that has been running for millennia. A dark rock on a white plain is impossible to miss. Teams ride out on snowmobiles in long spaced lines and simply pick them up. More than 50,000 meteorites have been recovered this way, which is the majority of all the meteorites in the world's collections, including pieces of the moon and pieces of Mars, blasted off those bodies by impacts and eventually delivered free of charge to a windswept patch of ice at the bottom of the earth, where somebody in a red parka was waiting. Let us stop for a moment in one of the strangest rooms in the world, because it is a very restful place to imagine, and because it is where all of that ice ends up. Somewhere in the northern hemisphere, in an ordinary building on an ordinary street, there is a cold room kept permanently at around minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, and inside it, on aluminum racks stacked from floor to ceiling, in long white insulated boxes, there is Antarctica. Ice core archives exist in several countries, and they hold tens of thousands of feet of core, cut into sections about a yard long, each one labeled with the project, the depth in meters, and nothing else, because nothing else is needed. The people who work in there wear the same clothing they would wear in the field, and they work in shifts of an hour or two before they have to come out. And they move slowly, because the floor is cold enough to be treacherous, and because a drop section is a piece of a particular millennium that will not be coming back. The core is cut lengthwise with a fine band saw, and it is cut according to a plan drawn up years in advance and argued over by dozens of laboratories. Because a single cylinder of ice has to be divided among every kind of measurement anybody wants to make on it, and once it is cut, it is cut. This strip goes for gas analysis, that one for water isotopes. This thin outer ring for chemistry, which must be taken from the inside rather than the surface because the drill fluid touched the outside. That segment stays whole and untouched, archived indefinitely, for questions nobody has thought of yet, on the reasonable grounds that in 50 years there will be instruments we cannot currently imagine, and it would be unforgivable to have used everything up. When a section is put on a light table, you can see the years. Near the top they are inches apart, and near the bottom they are thinner than a fingernail, dozens to the inch, folded and compressed but still in order. You can see the ash layer from a volcano has a faint gray line. You can see sometimes a slightly clearer band that means a summer with a little melt, and in Antarctica a melt layer is such a rare event that a single one is a piece of news. And you can see the bubbles, thousands of them, silver and round, each one holding a mouthful of air from a specific year. That is the detail that tends to stop people in that room the first time. If you put your face close to a section under the light, you are looking at air that has not been breathed by anything. It has been sitting in that bubble at that pressure in the dark under a growing weight of snow since before the pyramids, or since before the last ice age, or since before there was anybody at all to breathe it. In an hour it may be released into a mass spectrometer and measured and written down and become a number in a column in a paper that a few hundred people will read carefully and a few million will hear about vaguely. And that will be the first and only time it interacts with the world. There is something oddly gentle about the whole operation. It is a library nobody built on purpose, cataloged in the order it was written, retrieved a yard at a time by people in enormous coats, and read one bubble at a time in rooms colder than a freezer, by researchers who are unfailingly careful with it, because they all know perfectly well that it is not renewable. There is exactly as much of the 8th century as there is, and no more will be arriving. So picture that room for a moment as you drift, the low hum of the refrigeration, the pale blue light through a slice of clear ice, the rows of white boxes going away into the dark, and inside them, in order, in silence, 800,000 quiet winters waiting to be asked a question. Fact number 78. For most of recorded history, the entire continent was a rumor. The ancient Greeks reasoned that there ought to be land in the far south, purely on the grounds of symmetry. They knew of a northern region beneath the constellation of the Bear, which they called Arctos, and they assumed there must be an opposite one to balance it, and they called that one Antarcticos. The opposite of the Bear. They had no evidence of any kind. It was a guess based on a feeling that the world should be tidy. That guess sat on maps for around 2,000 years as a vast imaginary landmass labeled the unknown southern land, drawn in whatever shape a given cartographer felt was appropriate, occasionally furnished with speculative rivers and speculative kingdoms. Captain James Cook sailed south in the 1770s to settle the matter, crossed the Antarctic Circle 3 times, became the first person known to have done so, and was turned back every time by pack ice. He concluded that if there was land down there, it lay beyond the ice and was of no use to anybody, and he was, for practical purposes of his own century, entirely right. Fact number 79. The continent itself was not seen until 1820, and even then it was seen 3 times in a matter of months by 3 separate parties who had no idea the others were there. A Russian expedition under Bellingshausen sighted an ice shelf in January. A British naval officer, Edward Bransfield, sighted the Antarctic Peninsula a few days later. And an American sealer named Nathaniel Palmer, aged 21 and looking for seals rather than glory, sighted land later that year. Who saw it first is still argued about in a friendly way by 3 countries. The point that tends to get lost is how late it was. Antarctica was the last continent found. When the first human eyes settled on it, the United States was already 44 years old. Beethoven was still alive and composing, and the entire rest of the world had been mapped, colonized, argued over, and drawn. And nobody set foot on the mainland with any certainty for another 75 years after that. Fact number 80. Then, in a burst of about 15 years around the turn of the 20th century, the continent went from unvisited to famous. And the center of that was the race to the South Pole. In 1911, 2 expeditions were in the field at once. The Norwegian party under Roald Amundsen had come south quietly, having originally announced they were going to the Arctic and had wintered at the Bay of Whales. The British party under Robert Falcon Scott was based at Cape Evans on Ross Island. With a much larger scientific program and a much more complicated plan. Amundsen's approach was ruthlessly simple and built entirely around dogs, 52 of them, a small team of expert skiers, depots laid early and marked with lines of flags stretched crosswise so that they could be found in bad visibility, and a willingness to use the dogs as food for the other dogs and the men as the loads lightened. Which is a grim arithmetic that he had worked out in advance and did not flinch from. He reached the pole on the 14th of December, 1911, stayed 3 days, took careful observations to prove it, left a tent and a letter, and skied home without losing a single man. Fact number 81. Scott's party reached the same spot on the 17th of January, 1912, and found the Norwegian tent and the flag already there. 5 men had made the final march, hauling their own sledges by hand, and they turned around 800 miles from safety in deteriorating weather with the season closing behind them. None of them came home. What is often missed in the telling is what they were carrying when they were found. On the way back, already weakening, the party had stopped at the Beardmore Glacier and collected 35 pounds of rock samples, and they kept those 35 pounds on the sledge to the very end, when they were abandoning almost everything else. Among the specimens was fossil Glossopteris, a seed fern, evidence that Antarctica had once been forested and had once been joined to India and South America and Australia. It was a genuinely important scientific result. Men who knew they were probably going to die dragged the proof of it across a glacier because it was the job they had come to do, and the samples were recovered. And they are still held in the collection of a museum in London today. Fact number 82. A year later came the expedition that failed most completely and is remembered most fondly, which is not a coincidence. Ernest Shackleton set out in 1914 intending to cross the entire continent on foot. His ship, Endurance, never reached the shore. It was caught in the pack ice of the Weddell Sea, drifted with it for 10 months, was slowly crushed, and sank. 28 men were left standing on floating sea ice in the middle of nowhere, with 3 small boats, no radio, and nobody in the world aware of their position. They camped on the ice for 5 months as it drifted north, then took the boats to a bare, uninhabited rock called Elephant Island. From there, Shackleton and 5 others sailed one of those boats, 22.5 feet long, 800 miles across the roughest ocean on the planet to South Georgia, navigating by sextant with 4 brief sightings of the sun in 16 days. They landed on the wrong side of the island, and 3 of them then crossed its unmapped interior of glaciers and peaks on foot in 36 hours, with no tent, no map, and screws driven through their boot soles for grip. It took 4 attempts over 4 months to get a ship back through the ice to Elephant Island. Every one of the 28 men was still alive. Fact number 83. The most extraordinary solitary walk in the history of the continent belongs to Douglas Mawson, the Australian geologist who had turned down a place on Scott's Polar Party in order to run his own expedition, on the reasonable grounds that he was more interested in the continent than in the pole. In 1912, Mawson set out east from Commonwealth Bay with 2 companions, Belgrave Ninnis and Xavier Mertz, and a team of dogs. 300 miles out, Ninnis went through a snow bridge over a crevasse with the sledge that carried almost all of the food, the tent, and the best dogs, and did not come back up. The 2 survivors turned for home with about a week and a half of rations and 300 miles to cover. They ate the remaining dogs as they went. Mertz weakened and died on the way. Mawson continued alone on a diet that had by then included a great deal of dog liver, which is extremely rich in vitamin A, and he became ill in ways that nobody at the time understood, losing the skin from the soles of his feet, which he bound back on with bandages and walked on. He fell into a crevasse and hung from the rope and climbed out. He arrived back at the hut a few hours after the relief ship had sailed and spent another winter on the ice. He lived another 45 years and has been on an Australian banknote. Fact number 84. All of that heroic age activity produced flags, claims, and overlapping paper empires, and by the middle of the 20th century, 7 countries had formally claimed slices of Antarctica, several of them overlapping each other, and 2 more reserved the right to claim without doing so. It was shaping up in the tense atmosphere of the 1950s to be an extremely awkward place. What diffused it was a scientific event, the International Geophysical Year of 1957 to 58, during which 12 nations put research stations across the continent and, to their mild surprise, found the arrangement worked rather well. Out of that came the Antarctic Treaty, signed in Washington in December 1959 and in force from 1961. It is a short document by the standards of international law, and it does something almost unheard of. It freezes every territorial claim in place without resolving any of them, sets the entire continent aside for peaceful scientific use, forbids all military activity, forbids nuclear explosions and the disposal of radioactive waste, and guarantees any signatory the right to inspect any other signatory stations at any time without notice. Fact number 85. That treaty has now held for over 60 years, and it has grown from 12 signatories to more than 50. There has never been a war in Antarctica. There has never been a shot fired in anger between nations there. It is the only continent on this planet of which that can be said, and it is arguably the most successful arms control agreement ever written, largely because it was written before there was anything to fight over, and while everybody involved still found the whole idea slightly ridiculous. Later agreements added to it a convention protecting seals, a convention managing the krill fishery, and, in 1991, an environmental protocol that banned all mineral and oil extraction outright, indefinitely, whatever is under that ice, in the way of coal or iron or oil, stays there. Every nation with a claim agreed to it. There is something faintly astonishing about a piece of the world where the argument was settled by everybody agreeing to leave the argument where it was and go and do some science instead. Fact number 86. Nobody is from Antarctica. There is no indigenous population, there never has been one, and there is no permanent civilian population now. The continent has no government, no capital, no currency, no army, no police force, and no citizens. What it has is staff. In the summer, roughly 4,000 to 5,000 people are on the continent across all the national programs. In the winter, when the aircraft stop and the sea ice closes, the number falls to around 1,000, spread across about 40 stations, most of them very small. The largest, by a wide margin, is McMurdo Station on Ross Island, run by the United States, which in a busy summer holds around 1,000 people and looks less like a research base than like a slightly grim mining town, with roads, dormitories, a fuel depot, a fire station, workshops, a chapel, and a great deal of gravel. It is nobody's hometown. Every single person there has a return ticket and knows the date on it. Fact number 87. The winter is the part that changes people. Once the last flight leaves in February, a station is on its own until roughly October. No arrivals, no departures, no medical evacuation except in the most extreme circumstances, and at the inland stations, no daylight at all for months. Crews are small, usually somewhere between 10 and 50. Every one of them has been screened psychologically. They work, they maintain the station, they run the instruments, they watch a great many films, and they develop the strange local customs that small, isolated groups always develop. The midwinter dinner on the 21st of June. The exchange of greetings between every station on the continent on that same day, a tradition going back to Scott's Hut and unbroken since. There is a documented condition informally known as the Antarctic stare, in which a person stops mid-task and looks at nothing in particular for a long moment, and the crews recognize it in each other without commenting on it. Because commenting on it is considered unnecessary. And when the sun finally comes back in the spring, they go outside and stand in it, all of them, in a line, not saying very much. Stay with the winter people for a little longer, because a night at a station in the middle of the long dark is one of the coziest things it is possible to picture, and it is happening somewhere right now. Imagine a building on stilts on an ice shelf, or a cluster of linked modules under a dome of drifted snow with one row of small bright windows and everything else black. Inside, the corridors are warm and slightly too dry and smell faintly of diesel and coffee and floor polish. There is a generator running somewhere, and its sound is so constant that everybody there has stopped hearing it and will only notice it in the moment it ever stops. The floors are lined with boots. There is a whiteboard by the door with a list of names on it and a magnet beside each name. And the rule is that if you go outside, you move your magnet, and if you do not come back within your stated time, somebody comes to find you, and this system is very simple and has saved lives. Out beyond the last window, the wind is doing something. It is always doing something. There is a rope line strung from the main building to the instrument hut, waist high, with knots at intervals, so that in a whiteout a person can find their way back hand over hand without seeing anything at all. There will be somebody out there tonight walking that line in the dark with a head torch on, going to read an instrument that could probably report itself, because part of the job is to lay eyes on it once a day. That person will stop out in the middle and turn the torch off and stand there for a minute or two looking up. Everybody does this. The aurora will be going or it will not, and either way the stars are absurd and the ice underfoot will be faintly luminous, and then they will turn the torch back on and carry on to the hut because it is genuinely quite cold. Inside, the evening has the texture of a very small village. Somebody is cooking, and cooking matters enormously in a place where nothing else changes, so the cook is quietly the most important person on the base, and everybody is polite to them all winter. Somebody is fixing something, because something is always broken, and the nearest replacement part is 6,000 miles and 8 months away. And the ability to make a working object out of two broken ones is the most respected skill on the continent. There is a shelf of paperbacks left behind by people who wintered a decade ago, all of them slightly swollen from the dry air. There is a film on. There is a jigsaw half done that has been half done for 3 weeks and which people add 2 pieces to as they pass. There is a greenhouse, in some stations, a small hydroponic cupboard with lettuce and herbs in it, and it is visited far more often than the amount of lettuce would justify, because it is the only green thing within 1,000 miles and because it smells like somewhere else. And on the 21st of June, midwinter, the darkest day, they will have a dinner. They will get out whatever has been saved for it and print menus and put on whatever passes for formal clothing in a place with no formal occasions and eat far too much, and every station on the continent will send greetings to every other station. A tradition that runs unbroken back past the Antarctic Treaty, past Mawson. Past Scott's hut on Ross Island, where they held a midwinter dinner in 1911 with a small paper menu that still exists. 40-odd bases, 1,000 people, 40 different languages, all of them scattered across the emptiest continent on Earth, all of them in the dark, all of them sending a friendly message on the same night to strangers they will never meet. On the shared understanding that it is a long way through to spring and it helps to be reminded that somebody else is out there too. Which is not, when you think about it, a bad description of what you are doing right now, listening to this. So, let the generator hum. Let the wind do whatever it is doing out there against the window. Somebody has walked the rope line and come back and moved their magnet, and everybody is accounted for, and the pot is on, and there is nothing at all left to do tonight. Fact number 88. A very small number of people have nonetheless been born there, and it was done deliberately, for reasons that had nothing to do with obstetrics. In the late 1970s, Argentina flew a pregnant woman down to its Esperanza base on the Antarctic Peninsula, and in January 1978, a boy named Emilio Marcos Palma was born there, the first human being known to have been born on the continent. Chile followed with births at its own base a few years later. The motive was territorial. Both countries have overlapping claims on the peninsula and a civilian population, complete with families, school children, and a registry office, looks considerably more like sovereignty than a hut full of scientists does. Esperanza today has a school, a chapel, and a small clutch of houses painted bright orange against the snow, and children have grown up there, learning to read in a place with no trees. The treaty means none of it advances anybody's legal claim by a single inch, and everybody involved knows this perfectly well, and the base carries on regardless, which is a very human way to handle an unresolvable disagreement, not by settling it, but by continuing to make a polite point about it for 50 years. Fact number 89. Antarctica has active volcanoes, and the most accessible of them is one of the odder places on Earth. Mount Erebus on Ross Island stands 12,448 feet high, is permanently snow-covered, and holds in its summit crater a lake of molten lava that has been there, exposed and churning, since at least 1972. There are only a handful of persistent lava lakes in the world, and this is the southernmost, and it sits inside a mountain of ice. The lava is unusual in composition, rich in a mineral that produces large golden crystals, and the volcano periodically throws out molten bombs studded with them, so that the snow around the crater rim is scattered with lumps of black glass containing gemstones. The mountain also creates ice towers. Volcanic gas escaping through fumaroles on the flanks meets air at 50 below, and the moisture in it freezes instantly around the vent, building hollow chimneys of ice up to 60 feet tall, steaming gently, standing in groups on the slope like something abandoned. Inside and beneath them are caves of ice warmed by the volcano, dark, humid, above freezing, and full of microbial life found nowhere else. Fact number 90. There is another volcano, Deception Island, which is a caldera with one wall breached by the sea so that a ship can sail through a narrow gap called Neptune's Bellows and find itself floating inside a volcano in a perfectly sheltered circular harbor. It has been a sealing station, a whaling station, a British base, and a Chilean base, and it erupted in 1967 and again in 1969 and destroyed most of that. The beaches there are black volcanic sand, and in places the ground is hot enough that steam rises off the shoreline where snow is falling onto it, and the shallows are warm enough that people occasionally swim briefly in a bay ringed with glaciers. The ruins of the whaling station are still standing, rusted boilers the size of houses, a graveyard mostly buried by the eruptions, and rows of enormous iron tanks that once held oil rendered from whales, sitting on a black beach inside a live volcano, at the bottom of the world, with penguins walking past them. Fact number 91. Underneath the West Antarctic ice sheet there is a whole hidden volcanic province, and the scale of it only became clear recently. Surveys using radar and seismic data have identified around 138 volcanic cones buried beneath the ice of West Antarctica, of which perhaps 91 had never been recognized before, making it one of the densest concentrations of volcanoes anywhere on Earth comparable to East Africa. Most are almost certainly dormant. Some are not. Heat rising from below is one of the things helping to lubricate the base of certain glaciers, and in one case, a swarm of small earthquakes and a layer of ash preserved in the ice above indicate an eruption that happened around 2,200 years ago under the ice and melted a hole into it. It is a peculiar picture to hold, the coldest surface on the planet, resting on a landscape of buried craters with a slow trickle of heat coming up from underneath the whole time, doing its patient best against 2 miles of ice and losing, but not by as much as you would expect. Fact number 92. The single most consequential thing ever discovered in Antarctica was found by 3 people with an outdated instrument who were widely assumed to have made a mistake. In the 1970s and early 80s, a small British Antarctic survey team at Halley Station had been measuring ozone in the atmosphere above them year after year with a Dobson spectrophotometer, a device already regarded as somewhat old-fashioned. Their spring readings began dropping. By 1984, the ozone above them in October was down by about a third against the historical average, which was such a large change that the obvious explanation was a faulty instrument. They checked it. They brought in a second one. The readings held. When they published in 1985 the satellite data, which covered the whole continent and should have caught it years earlier, was rechecked. And it turned out the processing software had been quietly discarding the low values as impossible errors. The hole had been there for years and had been thrown away every time it was measured, because nobody had believed a number that big could be real. Fact number 93. The reason the hole formed over Antarctica specifically rather than anywhere else is one of the neatest chains of cause and effect in atmospheric science, and every link in it is Antarctic. During the polar winter, the wind circling the continent tightened into a closed loop called the polar vortex, which seals the air above Antarctica off from the rest of the atmosphere for months. Inside that sealed pocket, temperatures in the stratosphere fall low enough for a very rare kind of cloud to form, made of nitric acid and ice, polar stratospheric clouds, which are visible from the ground as pale, iridescent, mother-of-pearl sheets, and are genuinely beautiful, and are also the mechanism. Chlorine compounds released from refrigerants and aerosol propellants, which are harmless in that form, settle onto the surfaces of those cloud particles all winter and are chemically converted into a reactive form, and there they sit, loaded and waiting in the dark. Then the sun comes back in September, and the sunlight triggers the reaction all at once, and the ozone above the continent is destroyed in a matter of weeks. It requires darkness, then extreme cold, then a sealed atmosphere, then a sunrise in that order. Antarctica is the only place on Earth that provides all four. Fact number 94. What happened next is, quietly, the most encouraging story in modern environmental history. The paper appeared in 1985. The Montreal Protocol, banning the chemicals responsible, was agreed in 1987, tightened repeatedly afterwards, and eventually ratified by every single country in the world, which no other treaty of any kind has ever achieved. Production of the offending compounds essentially ended. And because those molecules are long-lived, nothing appeared to improve for a very long time. And there were 2 decades in which it would have been easy to conclude that the whole exercise had been pointless. It was not. The ozone layer over Antarctica has been measurably recovering since around the year 2000, and current projections have it returning to its 1980s condition somewhere around the middle of this century. It was found by 3 people with an old instrument at a station on an ice shelf doing the same boring measurement every year for a decade, because that was the job, and the world fixed it. Fact number 95. Antarctica is also where the sky is quietest, and this has made it the address of some very strange machinery. At the South Pole, there is a neutrino observatory called IceCube, and it does not look like a telescope at all, because it is not on the surface. It is a cubic kilometer of the ice sheet itself, threaded with over 5,000 optical sensors lowered down 86 boreholes to depths of up to 8,000 feet, melted through the ice with a hot water drill, and then allowed to freeze solid around the instruments forever. The ice at that depth is extraordinarily clear and extraordinarily dark. And when a neutrino from somewhere out in the universe passes through the Earth and happens very rarely to interact with a single atom in that ice, it produces a faint blue flash. And the sensors record which one saw it and in what order. And from that, the direction the particle came from can be reconstructed. So the instrument is a cube of ancient Antarctic ice buried under the pole, watching for flashes of light produced by particles that arrived from exploding stars, and it looks downward through the whole planet to see the northern sky. Fact number 96. There is a related project which has produced perhaps the loveliest phrase in Antarctic science. The balloon-borne experiments that fly around the continent for weeks at a time. Because of the same circumpolar vortex, a balloon released at the right season from near McMurdo will be carried steadily westward in a great circle around the pole at an altitude of around 120,000 feet, above 99.5% of the atmosphere, in continuous daylight, and will come back round to approximately where it started, sometimes 2 or 3 times, over the course of a month. This is called a long-duration balloon flight, and it gives researchers something close to the conditions of space for a fraction of the cost of going there. Some of the payloads carried this way have measured cosmic rays. Some have looked at the faint afterglow of the early universe. The instrument is launched from a plane of ice by a ground crew in heavy gloves. And then it circles the bottom of the world by itself for weeks, and eventually a command is sent, and it comes down under a parachute somewhere on the plateau, and somebody has to go and find it. Fact number 97. There is one sound in Antarctica that people find harder to forget than any other, and it is the sound of the sea ice singing. When a plate of ice flexes, or when 2 floes grind against each other, or when a swell passes underneath and the whole sheet has to bend to accommodate it, the ice makes noises that no listener is prepared for. Long descending whistles, rising chirps, groans, deep booms that travel for miles, and a sustained ringing that sounds unmistakably like a musical instrument being played badly by somebody very large. In the water, hydrophones lowered under the ice pick up an environment that is anything but silent, layered with seal calls and ice noise and the distant low-frequency moan of a whale 40 miles away. On the surface, on a still day, you can lie down on the sea ice and hear it working beneath you, and it does not sound like a landscape at all. It sounds like something that is thinking about something. And before the last 3 facts, let us have one warm scene, because we have spent nearly the whole night in the dark and the interior, and there is another Antarctica which is bright and loud and crowded and only lasts a few weeks. Picture the coast in high summer, in December, somewhere along the peninsula. The sun is up and it will not be going down, and the light comes in low and sideways all night long, so that everything is permanently lit as though it was 7 in the evening, and the sea is the color of dark glass, with a skin of brash ice on it, small floating pieces knocking gently together with a sound like ice in a glass being turned. There are icebergs standing offshore, blue at the waterline where the sea has undercut them, white and crumbling on top, and every so often one of them shifts its balance and rolls, slowly, enormously, with a sigh of displaced water. Along the shore there is bare rock, warm to the touch where the sun has been on it, streaked with orange and green lichen, and pooled meltwater in the hollows. And moss that squeaks when you tread on it. And there is noise. This is the surprise for anyone who has come in from the plateau. A penguin colony in summer is a small industrial town. Tens of thousands of birds calling continuously, a flat, harsh braying sound layered on itself until it becomes a single wall of noise that carries a mile downwind, punctuated by squabbles about gravel and the thin, persistent whistling of chicks demanding to be fed. It also, unmistakably, smells in a way that no documentary has ever been able to convey, and every visitor remembers for the rest of their life. Skuas patrol the edges. Sheathbills walk about looking for anything overlooked. There are seals hauled out on the rocks doing absolutely nothing with great commitment, occasionally opening one eye, and the beach smells of salt and guano and warm stone and cold water. And offshore, there are whales. Not one whale, not a distant spout on the horizon, but feeding groups, working through a krill swarm in water so thick with it that the surface looks bruised, and you can hear them breathing. That is the sound people describe most often, not the sight of a whale, but the sound of one exhaling. A deep sudden rush 100 yards away in still air, and then the long silence, and then another one from somewhere else. And behind all of it, at intervals, the glaciers at the head of the bay let go. A calving is not dramatic to look at. There is a crack like a rifle shot, which arrives late because sound is slow, and then a section of a cliff of ice slides down into the sea almost gently. And then a wave comes across the bay and rocks the brash ice against the shore for several minutes afterwards. And then it is quiet again. It is a landscape doing ordinary maintenance. It happens several times an hour. This is the Antarctica that most of the small number of people who ever go there actually see. Bright, busy, temporary, at the very edge of the continent, with the real thing standing behind it in white silence for 2,000 miles. Almost nobody goes further in. The tourists come to the peninsula in ships in January and stand on shingle beaches for an hour at a time and go home. And the scientists mostly stay near the coast where the work and the aircraft and the fuel are. The interior is left alone, and in any given winter the entire population of the deep field is a handful of people in a handful of huts, sitting inside a continent the size of 2 Europes in the dark. And in 6 weeks, all of this coastal noise will begin to shut down. The chicks will fledge and go to sea. The whales will move north. The sea will start to close over again. Grease ice, then Brazil, then pancakes, then a lid, and it will spread outward at a rate of several miles a day. And the beach with the warm rocks will be under snow, and the bay where the whales were breathing will be a white plain that you could walk across. And the emperors will come out of the water and start walking inland, and the whole thing will begin again. Hold that for a moment as we come to the end, the bright, loud, crowded edge, and the vast, still silence behind it, both of them the same continent, taking turns. Fact number 98. Underneath all of it, buried in the middle of East Antarctica, there is a mountain range nobody has ever seen. It is called the Gomburtsev Subglacial Mountains. It was detected by a Soviet expedition in 1958, and it is roughly the size of the European Alps, about 750 miles long, with peaks rising to around 9,000 feet, sharp summits, deep valleys, and a network of what appear to be classic glacial valleys carved long before the ice sheet swallowed them. The whole range is currently under between 1 and 3 miles of ice. Not 1 square inch of it has ever been looked at directly by anybody. Everything we know about its shape comes from radar, echoes, and gravity measurements, and magnetic surveys flown back and forth above a featureless white plain. And it is one of the great puzzles of the continent, because mountains that size are normally young, made by continents colliding. And this range appears to be extremely old and to be sitting in the middle of a stable landmass where nothing has collided with anything for a very long time. It is also probably where the ice sheet began. The first snow that never melted almost certainly settled on those summits and grew outward from them and eventually rose over their heads and put them out of sight for 34 million years. Fact number 99. And beneath the ice there is a canyon deeper than the Grand Canyon and a trench deeper than any dry land on Earth. Radar surveys of the Denman Glacier in East Antarctica revealed that its bed descends to about 11,500 feet below sea level, which makes it the lowest point on any continental landmass anywhere, a full mile and a half further down than the shore of the Dead Sea. Under the Bentley Subglacial Trench in West Antarctica, the bedrock lies more than 8,000 feet below sea level, and it is bone dry down there, filled entirely with ice. Elsewhere, beneath Princess Elizabeth Land, a canyon system over 600 miles long and up to 3,000 feet deep has been traced through the rock, cut by rivers or by ancient ice long before anything human existed. So the true surface of Antarctica, the actual rock, is a landscape with alpine ranges, canyon systems, coastal plains, deep basins, and the lowest ground on Earth, and it is a landscape nobody will ever visit, mapped entirely by instruments flying overhead, and every single feature of it has been named by people who have never seen it. Fact number 100, and the last fact is the one that puts all the others in order. The ice sheet you have been listening to all night keeps time, and it keeps it honestly, because it has no opinion about what it records. It is a stack of 800,000 winters, or perhaps 1.5 million, laid down one at a time, each holding its own sample of air and its own dust and its own trace of every volcano that went off that year, and it did not do any of that on purpose. It has recorded the ice ages and the warm periods between them. It holds the ash of eruptions that ended cities nobody wrote down. It holds lead from Roman smelting furnaces, faint but measurable, arriving on the wind from the other side of the planet 2,000 years ago and settling on the snow. It holds the fallout of the atomic tests of the 1950s as a sharp, bright line, and above that the lead from a century of leaded petrol, and then the fading of that lead again after the world agreed to stop. Every large thing our species has ever done to the air is written into the bottom of the world in order, in a column of ice, in a place where almost nobody lives and where no war has ever been fought. That is the continent. It is the coldest, driest, windiest, highest, and emptiest of them all. It has no capital, no citizens, no government, and no owner. It has 2 flowering plants, 1 native insect, no trees, and no land mammals whatsoever. It holds most of the fresh water on this planet, a range of mountains nobody has seen, 600 lakes nobody has visited, and a bird that walks 50 miles into the dark to stand still for 4 months holding 1 egg on its feet. And it is out there right now, tonight, while you are lying here. The sea ice is spreading or shrinking. A shelf the size of a country is easing seaward by a few inches. A snow petrel is asleep in a crack in a rock its ancestors have used since the last ice age. Somewhere on the plateau, the coldest air on Earth is settling into a shallow hollow that nobody will ever stand in. And 2.5 miles down, in a lake older than our species, in absolute darkness. In water that has never once been disturbed, something very small is quietly getting on with its life. History does not disappear. It just becomes the ground beneath our feet, or in this case the ice, patient and layered and in no hurry at all. And it will still be there in the morning, whether anybody looks at it or not. So that was 100 sleepy facts about Antarctica. Are you still awake? If you are, there is another long, quiet video waiting for you on the screen, and it will begin on its own, and you do not have to do anything about it. If this one helped, you are welcome to leave a like and to subscribe if you would like more of these, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And do leave your location and your local time in the comments, so that the next sleepless person scrolling through at 3 in the morning knows they are not the only one awake. Now let the room go quiet. Let your shoulders come down one last gentle inch. Let the cold blue plane go on turning slowly under its stars without you, because it does not need you to watch it, and it will not mind at all if you drift off in the middle of a sentence. Close your eyes. Let the snow keep falling on the plateau, one thin, quiet layer at a time. Good night and sweet dreams.